Robb Stark remembered the murmurs in the great hall of Riverrun with a crystal clarity that unnerved him. A single torch's flame flickered along the stone walls, painting wavering shadows across the tired but resolute faces of his bannermen. They had come to call him king in the north, but he did not yet feel like a king. Even so, the crown they pressed upon him, the heavy iron circle set with small runes of the first men, felt less a burden and more a vow. He would fight for the north. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, he could not keep his mind from wandering to thoughts of taking the fight further south than any Stark had in centuries. The memory of his father's execution lingered like a festering wound, each recollection stoking a deeper kind of rage. Eddard Stark had been beheaded in King's Landing, condemned by a boy king wearing a golden crown that was as false as the promises made to him. Catelyn Stark's grief weighed heavily on her son, pressing him to ensure that justice was done, true Stark justice. And so, when the Northern Lords proclaimed him king in the north, Robb raised his voice in acceptance. He had not only the desire to avenge his father, but also the will to shield his people from any further acts of Lannister treachery. At first, the plan had been simple: secure the North's independence. But over hushed conversations in the halls of Riverrun, the idea of pushing beyond the boundaries of the Neck began to take shape. Men whispered of the vulnerability in King's Landing, of the turmoil among the Lannisters, the Tyrells, and the Baratheons. Renley Baratheon was mustering forces in the south to claim the Iron Throne, while Stannis Baratheon was rumored to be gathering his own loyal men at Dragonstone. The realms were fracturing, alliances sundered or tenuous. The Lannisters, for all their cunning and gold, were overextended. Edmure Tully, nursing a bandaged shoulder from an earlier skirmish, confided in Robb that the Riverlands were a battlefield that might never know peace while the Lannisters still held King's Landing. Walder Frey, ever cunning, hinted that he might be persuaded to bolster Robb's crossing once more, provided certain marriage alliances or boons were guaranteed. And the great Jon, Rickard Karstark, countless other northern lords, they bristled with a raw eagerness for battle, driven by the savage need to see Joffrey dethroned and punished for Ned Stark's death. Catelyn Stark, grief etched in every line of her face, spoke to her son one late evening as they walked along the parapets above Riverrun's flowing moat. "This is more than a war for the North, my son," she said. "You mean to bring justice to the Iron Throne itself." Her eyes flickered with the reflection of torchlight, and Robb could hear the tremble in her voice. Yet she did not discourage him. She merely pressed his hand, a single gesture that said more than words. She had lost Ned, but if taking the Iron Throne meant safeguarding the remainder of their family, she would accept the necessity of it. As the days lengthened into weeks, Robb's war councils grew in intensity. Roose Bolton, pallid and quiet, recommended caution, even subterfuge. Lord Bolton suggested that they sow chaos amid the Lannister lines, turning minor lords away with whispered promises. Others, men of a more direct approach, urged Robb to march with full force and trust in the old gods to guide his sword. In the midst of these debates, news arrived from King's Landing. King Joffrey's cruelty had escalated. Rumors spoke of flayed men in the streets for perceived disloyalty. Sansa Stark was rumored to be in danger, a hostage forced to watch her father's head on a spike day after day. Arya was missing. The letters from Varys, or from small folk who had slipped away, could not confirm her whereabouts. Worst of all, the city reeled under instability. The time to strike might soon be at hand. At last, Robb made his decision. He stood in the center of the Riverrun Hall one evening, dressed simply in leather and fur, gray wind at his side, and addressed the assembled lords. "We have bled. We have lost fathers, brothers, and sons. My father died because the Lannisters believed they held no threat to their power. They believed the North would stay locked in ice, content to guard its boundaries. But the North remembers. And I say we will bring winter to King's Landing." A hush fell, and then a roar of approval followed. The great Jon slapped his broad chest and let out a bellow. Rickard Karstark, who had lost 2 sons under Lannister blades, gripped the hilt of his sword with white knuckles. Lady Meage Mormont nodded in fierce agreement, her eyes as cold as the snows of Bear Island. There would be a cost to it, Robb knew, but if the realm was to find any peace, the North could not linger in half measures. So it was that the northern armies soon assembled under the twin banners of the dire Wolf of Stark and the Trout of Tully. Edmure would ride as Robb's second, dividing his forces to distract Tywin's host in the west while Robb marched on the more vulnerable roads to the capital. The scouts spoke of Tywin's preoccupation with securing Harrenhal and the other contested strongholds to maintain supply lines. The Iron Throne was not fully expecting a direct assault, or so it was said, because who would be bold enough to strike at the heart of the 7 kingdoms without forging alliances first? but boldness had become Robb's cloak and dagger. The war was not merely a contest of swords, it was a battle of wits. He planned to keep the Lannisters guessing. The region between the Riverlands and the Crownlands would become a labyrinth of misinformation, with Bolton's men sowing rumors among villagers and minor lords that Robb's forces meant to turn eastward or westward. Meanwhile, those loyal to Tywin or Joffrey would race to fortify the wrong roads. Riverrun's gates opened wide on a fog-bound dawn, revealing a disciplined host of Northmen and riverlords marching in lockstep. At the head rode Robb Stark, his auburn hair unbound, his eyes shining with youthful determination. Gray wind padded beside him, an impossible silhouette of power and silent loyalty. The banners snapped in the cold wind, stark gray and Tully red, both defiant against the drab sky. Yet, beneath the pride and determination, Robb's heart was not untouched by doubt. He was young, and every step south carried him deeper into a realm of cunning plots and betrayals. There were no illusions about the hazards. The Red Keep was a place of tangled secrets, and even with an army at his back, kings had faltered beneath the weight of southern intrigues. He resolved that if he claimed the Iron Throne, he would do so with honor, and use it to reshape a kingdom that would value justice and peace. They rode on, crossing fields that were still charred from the last Lannister raid, scattered with broken blades and battered shields. Along the horizon, peasants emerged from behind hedgerows to watch them pass, some with hope in their eyes, others with fear. Robb tried to imagine what Ned Stark would have done, how he would have spoken to these people. He would have reminded them that winter comes for all. He might have said that war is as cold as any winter, and only by standing together can we weather its wrath. For a moment, Robb recalled how his father once told him that the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. In that sentiment, Robb found resolve. He might be leading this great host, but he was not alone. The North marched with him, bearing the memory of a beloved patriarch who had always sought justice above all else. And now, with the realm divided, perhaps the North's intervention could prevent further bloodshed in a war that would otherwise splinter the Seven Kingdoms into pieces. The march was far from easy, and each day the army advanced brought fresh challenges. Rains turned the dirt roads into mud that clung to boots and horses alike. Food supplies needed constant replenishment, forcing the foragers to fan out in search of grain and game. They dealt with skittish villagers who dared not offer hospitality lest the Lannisters later ride through in retribution. Still, for every man who fled at the sight of their banners, another bowed low, quietly thanking the northern host for standing against the cruelty that had darkened the Iron Throne. When they finally neared the southern edges of the Riverlands, a patrol of outriders returned with alarming news. A detachment of Lannister scouts was camped not more than a league away, near a stream that fed into the Blackwater Rush. The War Council convened by torchlight. Catelyn stood near Robb, her face stern and resolute, while lords like Karstark and the Great John argued the merits of a surprise attack versus skirting around the Lannisters entirely. Robb listened, weighing each perspective. He recognized that the Lannisters' presence here could compromise the secrecy of his intended route. If these scouts reported back to Tywin, the advantage of surprise might be lost. Then again, an outright confrontation might also alert the Lannisters to his larger strategy unless he could dispatch them swiftly and decisively. Time stretched thin as the flickering torches ate into the darkness. Finally, Roose Bolton's quiet voice drew all eyes. "A quick, brutal engagement, my lord. Leave no survivors to tell tales." His expression was as calm as ice. Though Robb was uneasy around the man, he understood the rationale. Lannister tongues silenced would grant them precious hours more of secrecy. Robb gave a curt nod, scanning the assembled faces of his loyal lords. "At dawn we strike. Lord Umber, lead a pincer on the western flank with 100 men. Lord Karstark, take 50 light horse and strike from the north. I will take our main force to the south to prevent their escape. Let none ride off to carry word to Tywin." The men dispersed to ready their troops, and Robb found himself alone with his mother for a moment. Catelyn's voice was somber. "There will be no mercy, then," she remarked, though not in disapproval. She had seen too much to naively protest the cruelty of war. Robb sighed, meeting her gaze. "If we show mercy now, it may cost us more lives later. The Lannisters gave my father none. We must be swift." Dawn came pale and cold. Mist clung to the low hills like a ghostly curtain. Robb rode at the head of his men, Grey Wind loping silently by his side. The clank of steel was subdued by the wet grass, and they advanced carefully, hearts pounding in unison. He spotted the Lannister banners first, a small encampment of perhaps 60 men, unwary or perhaps just exhausted. The Red Lion's standard hung limp in the damp air, its grandiosity diminished by the gloom. A horn sounded low from the west. The Greyjoy's contingent thundered down the slope, whooping war cries. On the northern side, Karstark's riders broke from the tree-line, slicing into the startled Lannister scouts before they had a chance to form ranks. Robb urged his horse forward, leading the main force around the southern ridge to close the last escape route. The Lannisters were trapped in a deadly funnel. Surprise was their advantage. The Lannister men, half-armored and groggy, scrambled for swords and shields. Some fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered. Robb parried a desperate thrust from a freckled young knight, the blow ringing against his own steel. Grey Wind launched himself at another soldier, pulling him from horseback. Amid the chaos, Robb kept watch for stragglers, ensuring none slipped away. Every moment that passed, the ring of northern and riverland steel closed tighter. In minutes, it was over. The ground was slick with mud and blood. Horses whinnied in panic among the bodies of men who had, until moments ago, been sharing quiet conversation around their campfires. Robb dismounted, scanning the remnants of the fray. Some of the Lannisters lay wounded, groaning for aid. Others were too far gone to speak. He saw one older soldier, battered and half-buried in a puddle, gazing up at him with a mixture of shock and pleading. Karstark approached, flicking blood off his blade. His cold eyes surveyed the scene. "We should finish them," he growled. "They'll only slow us, and we cannot risk them escaping if they heal." Robb swallowed. His stomach churned at the thought, but he forced himself to remain resolute. Mercy was a luxury they could not afford, not here, not now. He nodded once, gravely. "Leave none who might carry word." Karstark strode away to carry out the grim order. It was the first time Robb ordered the execution of wounded men, and the act settled upon him like a heavy cloak of regret. Yet he knew that in this war, half measures could be lethal. If they intended to place him on the Iron Throne, such decisions might become commonplace. Would he grow numb to these horrors, or would the weight of them accumulate with each drop of blood spilled? The encampment was searched thoroughly. Messages from Tywin Lannister's main force revealed nothing surprising. They spoke only of planned scouting routes. Robb burned them, ensuring no scraps remained. For a brief time, the men rested, taking what provisions they could from the ruined camp. Dawn had fully broken now, revealing a stretch of the Blackwater Rush not far below them, its waters murky under the overcast sky. As they formed up to continue their march, the Great John rode alongside Robb, a mixture of pride and sadness on his broad face. "We struck a blow here, Your Grace," he said, using that title with a newly formed ease. "But King's Landing is still many leagues ahead. The road is paved with more than stone, it's paved with the blood of those who stand in our way." Robb nodded, spurring his horse onward. He turned his gaze south, imagining the spires of the Red Keep, the gilded thrones, and the cunning courtiers that awaited him. The war was only beginning, and he would need every ounce of courage and strategy to succeed. Yet each skirmish won brought them closer to the heart of the Seven Kingdoms. So long as the men followed him and the North's resolve remained unbroken, there was hope of victory. Within days, their maneuvers became more perilous. The Crownlands were dotted with small holdfasts and villages nominally loyal to King Joffrey. Some folded instantly under the sight of the Stark and Tully banners, offering what meager supplies they had. Others braced for attack, misguided in their resistance, and were quickly subdued. Robb spared as many innocents as he could, yet the long lines of refugees fleeing ahead of his army unsettled him. They carried their children and meager belongings on carts or on their backs, fear etched into their expressions. Had these people known any peace before the war? Or had the Lannisters' rule already stripped them of hope? Amid these weary marches, messengers filtered through, some from Edmure Tully, updating Robb on the situation in the west, others from shadowy sources near King's Landing. One parchment bore the wax seal of Peter Baelish, the Mockingbird imprint pressed into black wax. It contained flowery words of vague encouragement, hinting that the capital was rife with discord and that certain individuals might be willing to welcome a new power if courted appropriately. Robb read the message with a hardened expression. Baelish was slippery as an eel, and trusting him too much would be a fatal mistake. Yet the knowledge that King's Landing was as divided as ever gave Robb a shard of confidence. Not long after, the Outriders caught a prison wagon near the crossroads. Inside, they found a few ragged men and one woman, all in irons, escorted by a pair of gold cloaks. The gold cloaks surrendered without much resistance, clearly outnumbered by the Northmen. When questioned, they admitted they were transporting these prisoners to the Red Keep dungeons on suspicion of treason. It was difficult to know whether those charges held any merit in the labyrinth of King's Landing politics. Regardless, Robb ordered the prisoners freed. The woman, who called herself Mira, fell to her knees and blessed the old gods for sending the king in the north. She claimed her husband had been executed by Joffrey's men for speaking out against the crown's harsh taxes and that she was being taken to the city for questioning. She had no illusions about what that might entail. Shaken but grateful, she thanked Robb over and over, tears in her eyes. He offered her and the other prisoners the chance to remain under his protection, albeit at the rear of the host, until they could safely depart to find family elsewhere. They accepted, though fear lingered in their eyes. The next evening, Robb sat by the campfire, turning a piece of dry bread in his hands. The Great John was regaling anyone who would listen with exaggerated tales of the morning's battle, while others dozed or shared their own subdued conversations. Gray wind rested at Robb's feet, ears twitching at the nighttime sounds. Catelyn approached, a troubled look on her face. She knelt beside her son, glancing around to ensure no one else was within earshot. The men whisper that your plan is working, that Tywin Lannister scrambles to prepare for an attack at Harrenhal or along the Gold Road, she said. But they also whisper you've set your sights on the Iron Throne itself. Robb nodded, answering quietly. They are correct. If we strike now, we can catch King's Landing off guard. Whatever alliances Joffrey and Cersei might be trying to forge, they won't be strong enough to withstand a sudden assault from the north. Stannis is still on Dragonstone, building his forces. Renley is parading through the Reach from what we hear, but he's still far to the south. If we move quickly, we might claim the city before either of them can react. Catelyn closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a soft exhale. All for the sake of your father's memory, she murmured. He never wanted a throne. He wanted justice and honor. And this might be the only way to ensure justice, Robb replied, his voice tight. If Joffrey remains in power, more innocent people will die. Sansa, she's still there, Mother. We can't leave her to that monster. We have to do more than just ensure northern independence. We must root out the rot at the heart of the realm. Her hand grasped his shoulder, a gentle pressure. Then I will stand beside you, my son. Whatever path you choose, we will face the consequences together. As night deepened, Robb found his thoughts drifting to Sansa, to Arya, and even to Bran and Rickon, safe back at Winterfell under the watch of Maester Luwin. He wondered if they would understand these choices he was making. The burden of leadership weighed more heavily than any crown could, yet each day he felt a growing acceptance of his role. The dream of a just realm, where the North could stand proud and unharried, might be worth the dark deeds he had to commit along the way. The next morning, they broke camp early. Scouts reported a viable route that bypassed some of the more fortified Crownland villages, leading them closer to the Rosby Road. From there, the distance to King's Landing was not far. They would likely meet stiff resistance once their approach became known, but the Outriders promised to cover their tracks and sow misinformation. If all went well, by the time the Crown realized the northern host was upon them, it would be too late to organize a proper defense. Near midday, the column paused when a distant rumbling broke the monotony of marching feet. Thundering hooves approached from the west, and banners came into view. A golden rose on a field of green. The Tyrells. Immediately, men bristled, reaching for their weapons. Had Renley sent an advance party, or was this another feint? The Tyrell riders slowed upon seeing the massed ranks of Northmen. Their leader, a knight in gleaming armor trimmed with gold, raised a hand in a gesture of parley. Robb sent a handful of men to meet them while keeping the main force ready. The tension was palpable. When the Tyrell knight dismounted, he removed his helm to reveal a short-cropped beard and hawkish features. He introduced himself as Ser Colin of Greenbranch, claiming to ride under orders from Lord Mace Tyrell and King Renly Baratheon. His Grace Renly marches north from Bitterbridge, hoping to treat with the Northern King, Ser Colin announced. We heard rumor the king in the north had parted from the Riverlands. Now it seems that rumor was true. The mention of King Renly caused murmurs among Robb's men. Renly had declared himself the rightful king after Robert Baratheon's death, dismissing Joffrey as a bastard born of incest. Many lords flocked to his side, swayed by the Tyrell alliance. However, if Renley was indeed marching north, that meant he might be seeking common ground with Robb. Or he might be preparing to crush Robb before turning his attention to King's Landing. Robb rode forward, flanked by the great Jon and Bolton. He addressed Ser Colin directly. "You say King Renley wants to meet with me? What are his intentions toward the north?" Ser Colin bowed courteously. "He wishes to form an alliance, your grace. The Lannisters have committed grave injustices against both our houses. Together, we might root them out from King's Landing with ease. We request that you give us the honor of a discussion so we can forge terms of friendship and mutual benefit." A hush spread across the gathered soldiers. Robb glanced at his mother, who studied Ser Colin with narrowed eyes. Was this a trap? Or was it an opportunity? Allying with Renley and the Tyrells could bring enormous force to bear upon King's Landing, but it also risked binding the North to southern politics in ways Robb was loath to consider. Moreover, there was the looming figure of Stannis, the elder Baratheon brother, a man known for his rigid sense of justice and formidable naval power. Could the North outmaneuver them both? Robb made his decision swiftly. If this alliance could pave a quicker, less bloody path to dethroning the Lannisters and rescuing Sansa, he would be a fool not to at least listen. "We will speak with Renley. Tell your king that the king in the north will grant him a parley at a place of his choosing, so long as it is between our host and his. But we will not be led into a trap." Ser Colin nodded, relief visible on his face. "As you say, your grace. I will bring word back to King Renley at once. Expect him in a day's time, perhaps two." With that, the Tyrell riders departed, leaving the northern army in a swirl of speculation. The great Jon was boisterous, proclaiming they had no need of any southern king. Karstark was reserved but recognized the strategic advantage of having the Reach's vast forces as allies. Meanwhile, Roose Bolton said little, his pale eyes giving away nothing of his thoughts. Robb understood their fears. He too was wary. But part of him hoped that by joining with Renley, even temporarily, he could spare the North more bloodshed. If they presented a united front against the Lannisters, perhaps King's Landing would topple without a prolonged siege. That would mean fewer lives lost and a swifter rescue for Sansa. Yet alliances forged in war can be brittle, especially when so many crowns are at stake. As the day wore on, the northern host made slow progress, halting earlier than usual to prepare for the potential meeting with Renley. Robb set up a perimeter of guards, doubling the watch. He also sent word among his men to keep an ear out for any suspicious movements from the Tyrell scouts. If this was a ruse to gauge the strength of the northern army, Robb would not be caught unprepared. Night fell, and the campfires dotted the rolling plain like distant stars. Robb paced among the tents, occasionally stopping to speak with his bannermen. He found himself drawn to a hilltop where the wind blew softly over tall grass. From there, he could see a wide stretch of land, silvered by moonlight. Gray wind padded up behind him, pressing his muzzle against Robb's hand. Stroking the direwolf's thick fur, Robb gazed into the dark horizon. He wondered if Renley rode closer now, draped in his green and gold finery, smiling that charismatic smile he was rumored to possess. By contrast, Stannis would be a grim shadow waiting to stake his own claim. The Game of Thrones was being played in earnest, and Robb found himself not just a piece on the board, but a potential king among kings. Still, he reflected on his father's lessons: honor, justice, loyalty. If he sat upon the Iron Throne, would those virtues hold true, or would the crown corrupt him as it seemed to corrupt so many others? He had already ordered the massacre of Lannister scouts, sanctioned the killing of wounded foes. Would the list of sins only grow? Yet for all his doubts, one resolve burned bright: the North remembers. The North would not kneel to any false king again, not after what happened to Ned Stark. If forging an alliance with Renley was a step toward punishing those who had brought such ruin to his family, then so be it. He would do what was necessary. Justice and his father's memory demanded nothing less. Morning arrived with a tense stillness hovering over the camp. Men went about their routines quietly, some adjusting armor, others sharpening swords, while the cooks prepared a meager breakfast of porridge and salted meat. Robb felt the anticipation in the air, a charged hush that seemed to hint at the possibility of an alliance or a betrayal. True to Ser Colin's word, scouts brought word that a larger company approached from the south. Banners bearing the Stagan Rose appeared against the horizon, fluttering in the early morning light. Renley Baratheon's host, accompanied by Tyrell banners, was not small. Though many men had likely been left behind in far-off garrisons or traveling ahead, what approached was still a respectable force. Their armor gleamed, polished to a brightness seldom seen on the northern battlefield. Trumpets announced their arrival in brassy tones echoing over the plain. Robb noticed the colorful display of Renly's entourage, fine silk cloaks, embroidered tabards, the strong smell of perfumes mingling with the horse's sweat. It was a stark contrast to the more subdued, rough-spun northern garb. Renly himself led the way astride a tall courser. He was every bit the charismatic figure rumors claimed, handsome with a ready smile and an air of confidence that bordered on theatrical. Beside him rode Marjorie Tyrell, dark-haired and poised, her eyes flicking over the northern ranks with quiet curiosity. Close by, Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, carried himself with proud elegance, though his watchful gaze betrayed caution. Rows of Tyrell men followed, their banners sporting golden roses that cast a gleaming reflection in the daylight. Robb directed his guard to hold formation a short distance behind him as he rode out, flanked by the great John and Roose Bolton with several other nobles close by. Grey Wind loped at his side, drawing murmurs from the southern knights who had never seen a dire wolf before. Renly reined in his mount, halting a respectful distance away. For a moment, both parties observed each other in silence. Then Renly urged his horse forward at a walk, extending a friendly hand. "King in the North," he greeted, voice warm. "It gladdens me to see you, though I wish it could be under more peaceful circumstances." Robb inclined his head. "King Renly, you sought a parley, and here we are." Renly dismounted gracefully, handing his reins to a squire. He approached Robb on foot, making a clear gesture of openness. Robb, though cautious, followed suit. Standing on the grass, the two kings regarded each other. Renly was older by a few years, yet Robb's calm, measured gaze conveyed the hardened resolve of someone who had already tasted the pains of war. "I have heard talk of your victories in the Riverlands," Renly said. "They say the young wolf fights like the warrior himself and that your dire wolf strikes fear into the hearts of men." Robb allowed a small smile. "Rumor tends to embellish, but the men of the North and the Riverlands have fought hard. We mean to see justice done for my father, Eddard Stark, and for all those who have suffered under Lannister rule." Renly's eyes flickered, a cloud of sympathy or perhaps guilt passing through them. "Your father's demise was a tragedy for all the realm. Ned Stark was an honorable man, and his execution shattered any faith I had that Joffrey was rightful king. I do not recognize Joffrey's claim, nor does anyone who values honesty." Robb studied Renly, testing his sincerity. "You have declared yourself king of the Seven Kingdoms. Why should I join with you instead of marching alone on King's Landing?" A wry smile curved Renly's lips. "A direct attack might succeed, but with high cost. My army and the Tyrells stand ready to take the capital from the Lannisters as well. If we combine our forces, the city could be ours without a protracted siege. The people there are hungry and oppressed. Better we strike decisively, remove the Lannisters, and establish order before Stannis musters enough strength to challenge us. As for you, King in the North, your cause resonates with mine. Joffrey is a usurper. Let us dethrone him together." Roose Bolton interjected quietly. "And once Joffrey is gone, who wears the crown, your grace? The young wolf or the stag?" Renly's confidence did not waver. "I would sit the Iron Throne, but I would recognize the North's independence if that is what is desired. The realm is in chaos. Perhaps it is time to allow the North to govern itself. So long as we stand as allies, two kingdoms in mutual accord, we can maintain peace far better than under a single crown forced upon unwilling subjects." His words caused a stir among Robb's men, and the great John gave a hearty grunt of approval. Yet Robb remained cautious. "Fine words indeed," he said, "but words are often broken as easily as bread. You promise independence for the North if I help you seize King's Landing. Can you swear an oath to that?" Renly raised a hand. Marjorie Tyrell stepped forward, quiet yet radiating composure. "My lord husband has never been shy in his generosity. The Tyrells, too, support the notion that a war is best ended swiftly with minimal suffering to the small folk." Her voice was measured, a gentle lilt. "We stand for a united Westeros, but not under a tyrant's heel. If in the aftermath the North wishes to be free, that is a matter for the kings to settle with mutual respect." Robb glanced from Marjorie to Renly. He considered how easily this pair charmed others. Yet perhaps they were sincere enough for the moment. "I care most for my people. If letting the North stand as its own kingdom spares them from future Lannister betrayals, then I will not turn away from the idea. But if I aid in placing you upon the Iron Throne, I must be assured that Sansa Stark and Arya Stark, my sisters, are returned to me unharmed, and that no northern blood is spilled in pointless southern squabbles." Renly nodded gravely. "You have my vow. If we succeed together, your sisters will be placed under your protection, and I will not press the North to bend the knee. Join me, King Robb, and let us rid the realm of the Lannisters' tyranny." In that moment, Robb saw an image of the Red Keep's throne room, Joffrey's smug face replaced by Renly's smiling countenance. Renly lacked the stern gravitas of Stannis, and perhaps that was a boon. A more merciful king might heal the realm after so much bloodshed. Or perhaps mercy could be a weakness that cunning courtiers would exploit. Still, the promise of an alliance was tempting, an opportunity to avoid pitting the North against the Tyrell might of Highgarden. Robb stepped forward. The northern lords behind him seemed to hold their breath as he extended his hand. Then let it be so. We will march together on King's Landing. May our combined strength bring an end to the Lannisters once and for all. Renly clasped Robb's hand warmly, sealing the alliance. Cheers erupted from both sides, mingling into a single cacophony of applause and horn calls. For a brief moment, the tension melted, replaced by an almost festive air. Soldiers from the north and the Reach approached each other curiously, exchanging greetings, tasting one another's ale or cider. The lines that had divided them only hours before now blurred in the face of a common cause. In the following days, both armies broke their separate camps and formed into a single column with designated sections for each contingent. Logistics became more complex, but the Tyrell supply wagons were laden with fresh provisions, easing the burden for Robb's foragers. The Tyrells also brought skilled healers and even a few entertainers, bards who played rousing tunes in the evenings, which did wonders to lift morale. The differences in culture were stark. Northern men initially gawked at the elaborate feasts some Tyrell knights threw together with spiced wines and sugared fruits. Meanwhile, southern lords looked on with both respect and a touch of fear at the stoic discipline of Robb's bannermen, who cleaned and sharpened their weapons with single-minded focus. Through it all, Robb remained vigilant. He consulted frequently with Catelyn, Roose Bolton, and the Great John, listening to their concerns and adjusting troop deployments. He also made time to converse with Renly on matters of strategy and glean the measure of the man. In those discussions, he found Renly affable and open, but also somewhat frivolous. Renly seemed more a politician than a seasoned commander, though he was not without courage. The real military mind among his supporters was Loras Tyrell, who had trained with knights since boyhood. Loras suggested swift cavalry raids on the outskirts of King's Landing to sow panic before the main host arrived. Robb, who had engaged in similar tactics in the Riverlands, approved wholeheartedly. Soon, the combined host reached the outskirts of the Crownlands, where farmland gave way to denser pockets of population. Smoke from village chimneys dotted the horizon. Word of the alliance between the young wolf and King Renly spread quickly, carried by wandering travelers, gossiping peasants, and even ravens from uncertain lords. The Lannisters, cornered in King's Landing with only the city watch and any remaining loyal forces, would be forced to rely on the city's walls. Tywin was rumored to be at Harrenhal, trying to gather enough forces to break the encirclement, but the speed of Robb and Renly's advance left him little time. Spies came and went. One night, a messenger, hooded and cloaked, slipped into Renly's command tent. By dawn, rumors swirled that Stannis Baratheon had begun a siege of Storm's End, weakening Renly's base of power. Robb listened to these whispers with unease. If Stannis scored a major victory, he might then turn his fleet toward King's Landing. But for now, the road to the capital lay open. Perhaps it was wise to strike before any of these other factions could reinforce the Lannisters. Consolidating their forces, Renly and Robb established a war council in a spacious field tent. Both men sat at a makeshift table, maps of King's Landing and its surrounding terrain spread out before them. Around them stood an assortment of lords and knights, the Great John, Roose Bolton, Catelyn Stark, Loras Tyrell, Randall Tarley, and several more. Candlelight danced on their armor and cast tall shadows on the canvas walls. Loras traced a route on the map with a gauntlet finger. If we approach from the north along the Rosby Road, we can mask a portion of our cavalry in the woods near the city's eastern gates. At a signal, they can charge, diverting the gold cloaks and allowing the main host to press in from the west. The Great John nodded. I break them on two fronts. But we must be sure not to let them barricade themselves fully within the city. If they have time to close the gates, we'll be left with siege engines at best and weeks of waiting. Roose Bolton interjected with his quiet calm. The City Watch may not be entirely loyal to the Lannisters. King's Landing folk have little love for Joffrey's cruelty. If they see a large enough host, they may throw open the gates rather than face destruction. Marjorie Tyrell spoke up. We must also consider the small folks suffering. A long siege will starve the innocent. If they rise against the Lannisters from within, our entry will be simpler. But we must ensure they know we come to liberate, not to pillage. Robb's gaze moved from one speaker to the next, absorbing each viewpoint. Then let us proceed with this two-pronged approach. Loras, you lead the cavalry in the east. I'll bring the main body in from the west. Renly, you can hold a central reserve, ready to strike wherever the defense is weakest. We should send word ahead, discreetly if possible, to those in the city who might throw open the gates. Perhaps we can avoid the worst of the bloodshed." With the plan in place, the war council dispersed. Robb lingered, staring at the map. His stomach churned with nerves. Storming King's Landing was no small feat. Armies had broken themselves on those walls before. The city was enormous, its labyrinthine streets a haven for ambushes and treachery. But with Renly's forces beside him, the advantage was theirs. He thought of Sansa, a captive behind those walls, forced to endure the whims of Joffrey. Soon, he would have her back or die trying. The final march to King's Landing was swift. Their scouts reported minimal resistance. A few pockets of gold cloaks and loyal knights attempted to delay them, but these were quickly routed. Occasionally, a handful of hedge knights or minor lords would ride out, offering their blades in exchange for coin or future favor. Renly was more than willing to accept such turncoats, while Robb viewed them with a cooler eye. Still, every additional sword counted. Then, one afternoon, the high walls of King's Landing came into view. Sunlight glinted off the blackened towers and the Red Keep loomed on its rocky promontory. The city sprawled around it, a maze of buildings and narrow streets, home to thousands upon thousands of souls. Smoke from countless hearths smudged the sky. Drums and horns signaled the army's approach. Robb stood atop a slight rise, flanked by Bolton, the Great John, and Renly. Beneath them, a grand host spread out in organized ranks, the direwolf, the trout, the golden rose, and the crowned stag united in an unprecedented display of martial power. Even from here, Robb could sense the ripple of alarm that must be coursing through the city. The gates remained open, with wagons and small folk scurrying in, but it was only a matter of time before someone in command ordered them shut. Now, everything depended on timing. Loras Tyrell and his cavalry would swing around to the east, hidden by rolling hills and a copse of trees, and prepare to race for the city's side gates. Once he struck, the main force would surge forward from the west. Renly and his chosen knights would hold back briefly, ready to exploit any breach in the city's defenses. This was the moment all their planning had led to. The king in the north and the king in Highgarden's alliance would be tested in the crucible of battle. Robb guided his horse down the slope, rallying the men. He could see tension in their faces, but also determination. Each soldier understood that victory here could reshape the kingdom. For some, it was the promise of revenge against the Lannisters. For others, the dream of a new era free from tyranny. For Robb, it was everything: vengeance for Ned, rescue for his sisters, and the first step toward an honorable peace. The gold cloaks began to mobilize, bustling along the walls. Trumpets sounded from the city, muffled by distance. The gates that had remained open for commerce now rumbled as watchers rushed to close them. However, Loras's cavalry was faster than the watch anticipated. With a thunder of hooves, the Knight of Flowers led his riders out of the eastern hills, charging toward a smaller postern gate that overlooked a section of farmland. The gold cloaks struggled to react in time, arrows flying from the walls but mostly missing their marks. Then Loras's men were at the gate, hacking down the scant defenders. A cry went up from the city ramparts. Seizing the moment, Robb raised his sword, the Valyrian steel shining in the sun, ice reclaimed from the same blade used by Island Payne to execute his father. The wave of sorrow and fury in his chest fused into a single, driving command. Charge! The main host surged forward in a tide of steel and fury. Stark men, Tully men, Tyrell men, Baratheon men all advanced under the watchful eyes of their banners. Their footsteps shook the earth, a drumbeat of doom for any who dared oppose them. The gold cloaks at the western gate hurried to slam it shut. Siege ladders and rams prepared beforehand were dragged forward by the vanguard. Meanwhile, archers set up behind light barricades, launching volleys at the defenders on the walls. The city rang with alarms, bells, horns, shouts. Smoke began to rise from somewhere inside the walls, suggesting chaos had already ignited among the populace. Perhaps word had spread that the Northern King and King Renly were upon them. Perhaps some of the watch had turned cloak, letting in rebels from the inside. In war, confusion often reigned supreme. Arrows whistled past Robb as he pressed closer, gray wind snarling at his side. The monstrous dire wolf leapt at a gold cloak who dared to stand in the open, dragging him down before the man could even scream. Robb's heart hammered. This was the final test. He spurred his horse forward, adding his strength to the men maneuvering the battering ram toward the massive wooden gates. Renly's reserve force circled to the south, cutting off any route of escape or reinforcements from the Rosby Road. The coordination, so carefully planned, seemed to be working. Then, a sudden crash. Loras's cavalry had succeeded in breaching the eastern postern gate. Word spread like wildfire among the defenders. Some gold cloaks began to flee into the city rather than face the invaders. Others fought desperately on the walls, but it was clear the tide was turning. It did not take long for the ram to splinter the western gate, weakened as it was by half-panicked defenses. With a thunderous crack, the wood gave way and the combined force of men and horse poured into the city's streets. Robb called out to keep formation, not to let the initial rush devolve into chaos. But in the swirling dust and smoke where narrow alleys split from the main thoroughfare, control was hard to maintain. Street by street, the allied host advanced. Gold cloaks tried to form a rear guard, only to be overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of the charge. Civilians ran screaming, some welcoming the invaders, others terrified of the violence. Hovels burned, sparks dancing on the wind as the heat of battle intensified. The clangor of steel on steel echoed off the cramped walls, and the tang of blood filled the air. Robb pressed onward, leading a detachment toward the Red Keep itself. He would not rest until Sansa and Arya were safe. If Joffrey was still within these walls, Robb intended to personally see an end to the Boy King's cruelty. Around him, Northern bannermen shouted war cries. "Winter is coming," they bellowed, turning the Lannister phrase of "hear me roar" into a bitter memory. As they pushed deeper, sporadic groups of defenders attempted to mount resistance, but their morale was shattered. Robb caught sight of a group of gold cloaks dropping their weapons and fleeing, only to be cut down by the Greyjoy's relentless charge. Roose Bolton and his men moved with cold efficiency, dispatching any pockets of Lannister loyalists. Renly's knights, led by the resplendent Loras, carved a path through the wealthier districts, presumably heading for the main gate of the Red Keep. In the midst of the chaos, small folk cheered as they recognized the invading force was against King Joffrey. They thronged in alleyways, some throwing stones at fleeing gold cloaks, others jeering at the memory of the Mad King as if one tyrant was the same as the next. The city had known so many kings, so many broken promises. And yet here was another chance for salvation, or so they hoped. Finally, Robb and his men emerged into a wide courtyard before the towering walls of the Red Keep. Arrows rained from above, forcing them to take cover behind overturned carts and fallen masonry. The portcullis was drawn, a row of sharpened spikes preventing easy entry. Above the gatehouse, the Lannister banner still hung, gold and crimson defiant in the morning light, though the wind tore at its edges. Panting, Robb wiped sweat and soot from his brow. He surveyed the defenses, seeking a vulnerable point. Siege ladders would be risky, with archers entrenched on the battlements. They needed to find a side entrance or breach the portcullis quickly. If the Red Keep's garrison was not already shaken by the city's fall, they could mount a brutal last stand. He spotted Renly's knights circling from another street. The Knight of Flowers, his once shining armor now stained with dust and streaks of blood, joined Robb near the barricade. "We tried to force a gate at the southern side," Loras reported breathlessly, "but they barricaded it with rubble. Our men can't get through easily." "Then we press on here," Robb said. "If we can pry open the portcullis." A horn blast interrupted him, echoing down the street. Both men turned to see Renly himself riding through the swirling dust, his Stag and Rose banner snapping behind him. He wore a dented breastplate and carried a longsword dark with gore. When he reached them, he reined in his horse sharply. "The city is ours," Renly declared, face flushed with triumph. "We must seize the Red Keep now, before the defenders can rally. I have men setting up a ballista to breach that portcullis. Stay low until we can weaken it." Robb nodded, an urgent question burning in his mind. "Have you seen the king? Joffrey, or that wretch Cersei?" Renly shook his head. "Not yet. Word has it they're holed up in Maegor's Holdfast. We'll pry them out soon enough." From atop the battlements, arrows continued to fly, but their volume had lessened, perhaps indicating a dwindling supply or wavering courage. Soon, the clatter of heavy wheels announced the arrival of a massive ballista dragged by a team of sweating horses. Skilled engineers set it up under hurried instructions. Before long, they launched a massive iron-tipped bolt at the portcullis. The impact rang out, bending metal and splintering the wood behind it. Another shot followed, then another. Under the relentless pounding, the portcullis began to sag. A cheer went up from the gathered men. Seeing their chance, Robb rallied them. For the north, he roared, raising his sword high. "For Ned Stark." The cry was echoed by the Great Jon, Karstark, and others, melding with the Tyrell shouts of Highgarden and the Baratheon calls of Storm's End. In a wave of steel, they rushed forward. A final ballista shot tore through the portcullis, and the battered gatehouse gave way. The courtyard erupted into a frenzy as the allied force poured into the Red Keep. Lannister guards fought desperately, but the momentum was unstoppable. Robb pushed forward, gray wind at his side. He slammed aside a guard's spear, driving his sword into the man's chest. Another guard tried to strike from behind, but Grey Wind lunged, ripping the attacker's leg. Around Robb, the Greyjohn's battle cry echoed, and he glimpsed Roose Bolton's pale form weaving through the melee with lethal grace. At last, they reached the inner wards, corridors that twisted deeper into the fortress. Blood spattered the walls, and the air was thick with smoke and the coppery tang of death. Servants huddled in corners, hiding from the carnage. Robb shouted for them to stand aside, that they would not be harmed if they did not resist. He received wide-eyed stares in response. He thought of Sansa and Arya. Were they here, caged in some tower? The anxiety gnawed at him. His men fanned out, clearing each passage. Renly's knights surged elsewhere, determined to seize the throne room. In the chaos, Robb noticed a slight figure dart from behind a pillar. A young handmaiden, terror etched on her face. She pointed down a corridor and stammered, "Your sister! That way, my lord." Then she fled. Robb wasted no time, barking orders for a handful of his men to follow. He sprinted down the corridor, Grey Wind leading the way. The flicker of torchlight revealed a heavy wooden door at the far end. It was locked, but a few swift kicks from the Greatjon burst it open. Inside, cowering and disheveled, was Sansa Stark. She wore a dress torn at the hem, her face streaked with tears. The moment she saw Robb, she let out a sob, relief flooding her eyes. "Sansa!" he breathed, rushing to her. Grey Wind bounded up, sniffing at her skirts, tail wagging. She collapsed into Robb's arms, trembling. Words tumbled from her lips about Joffrey's cruelty, how he had threatened to parade her through the streets, how the city was on the brink of madness. Robb soothed her as best he could. "You're safe now. We have the city. We'll protect you." He wanted to ask about Arya, but Sansa shook her head. "I don't know where she is. She disappeared before father." Her voice faltered. Robb's heart twisted. If Arya was lost in the chaos of King's Landing, he had to hope she was resilient enough to survive. Leaving 2 men to guard Sansa, Robb pressed on, forging deeper into the Red Keep. Fear warred with determination as he navigated narrow hallways and hidden staircases. The fortress was vast, and any corner might house an ambush. The Greyjon's voice echoed behind him, urging caution. But Robb could not rest until Joffrey was found, until Cersei was brought to justice. Every step was a reminder of his father's final journey through these same corridors, a prisoner walking to his doom. Now Ned Stark's son walked them as a conqueror. End of excerpt. Robb moved through the labyrinthine passages with caution, guided by flickering torches that seemed to tremble under the weight of the Red Keep's history. Beyond every door lay the possibility of more Lannister loyalists or gold cloaks desperate enough to try their luck against the king in the north. The air felt heavy, thick with the acrid smell of smoke and fresh blood. Shouts echoed in the distance. Some were triumphant, some terrified, all blending into a cacophony of war. He kicked aside a fallen shield, scanning the corridors for any sign of Joffrey or his guards. Beside him, the Greatjon grunted, face flushed from the adrenaline of battle. Grey Wind took the lead, hackles raised, sniffing the air like a predator certain of prey. Occasionally, they passed Red Keep servants kneeling with arms over their heads, pleading for mercy. Robb spared them without hesitation. They had not wielded the sword against his people. They were no threat, but the fear in their eyes reminded him. The city had suffered under cruel rulers before, and no crown made its bearer inherently just. He had to be better. He had to be worthy of the ideals his father died to protect. The corridor opened into a gallery overlooking a courtyard within the keep. Through a narrow window, Robb saw Renly's banners crowding the inner walls, Tyrell knights hauling open storerooms and leading out dazed soldiers in tattered Lannister livery. Some of those men seemed half-starved or half-willing to surrender, as if they had never possessed any true loyalty to Joffrey. In other corners, the fighting still raged, the ring of steel echoing off stone. But from the vantage point high above, Robb could tell the battle for King's Landing was all but decided. The city had fallen to their alliance, only the last redoubt in Maegor's holdfast remained. Descending into a spiral stairwell, Robb and the Greatjon found themselves faced with a hasty barricade. Broken furniture and shards of wood piled together, with a handful of guards behind it clutching crossbows. The men trembled at the sight of the dire wolf that loomed in the half-lit gloom. One guard fired a bolt at Grey Wind in panic, but the angle was poor and the shot ricocheted off the stone. Before they could reload, the Great John let out a roar and flung a torch forward, scattering embers that made the guards recoil. Robb and his men rushed the barricade, hacking through the flimsy barrier. Two of the guards turned and ran, footsteps echoing away into the labyrinth. Another surrendered outright, tossing down his crossbow and begging for his life. Robb pressed past him, leaving the man to the Great John's mercy. He heard his bannerman growl something about traitors and crows, but the scuffle ended quickly and soon they were moving on. Each step took them deeper into the heart of the Red Keep and the halls grew more ornate. Rich tapestries depicting ancient Targaryen conquests hung on the walls, smoke staining their edges. The floor underfoot was polished marble, flecked with ominous dark stains that might have been spilled wine or blood. A muffled shriek drew Robb's attention to a side corridor. He froze, silent, and motioned for the others to do the same. There, behind a half-closed door, came more sounds, scuffling, frightened sobs. Grey Wind sniffed and snarled at the threshold. Robb shoved it open with his shoulder, sword at the ready, to find a slender Lannister guard forcing a handmaiden down against a table. The man's face twisted with equal parts lust and desperation. At the sight of armed Northmen, he released the girl and reached for his dagger. He never had a chance to use it. Grey Wind was on him in an instant, the direwolf's jaws crushing his arm. The man screamed, sputtered, then went silent under a swift slash from Robb's sword. The handmaiden scrambled back, sobbing. Her dress was torn at the collar, and her eyes shone with terror. Robb gestured for one of his men to see her out safely. "No harm will come to you now," he said quietly, though even as the words left his lips, he felt the hollowness of such a promise in the midst of violence. Still, she nodded gratefully and let herself be led from the room. Robb stared down at the dead guard and felt a surge of disgust for the cruelty men could inflict when unchecked by honor. The Great John clapped Robb on the shoulder. "You do your father proud," he said, his loud voice subdued for once. Robb gave a grim nod, then pressed forward, ignoring the tremor of unease in his chest. He had to stay focused. Somewhere ahead, Joffrey lurked, and possibly Cersei. If they eluded capture, or if they found a way to rouse hidden loyalists, the battle might flare up anew. A wider corridor led them closer to Maegor's Holdfast, separated from the main keep by a deep dry moat. The drawbridge to that fortress within a fortress was usually raised in times of siege, but it stood partially lowered, jammed at an odd angle as if half-dropped in haste. Bodies littered the approach, gold cloaks, Tyrell men, even a few in Baratheon livery. Smoke drifted from overturned braziers and a faint crackle of flame licked the underside of the drawbridge. Whoever had tried to hold this position had done so desperately. Robb's men tested the drawbridge. It creaked ominously but seemed stable enough to cross, though flames still nipped at its edges. He waved the Great John and two other stout warriors forward, leaving Roose Bolton and the rest of his detachment to secure the courtyard behind them. One by one, they picked their way over the half-lowered span. Beneath their boots lay nothing but blackness, the moat's depths nearly impossible to gauge in the gloom. Grey Wind padded across without hesitation, sniffing the air for any sign of more foes. They passed into a square courtyard inside Maegor's Holdfast. High stone walls loomed on every side and arrow slits lined the ramparts. The faint glow of torches revealed yet more signs of recent battle. A shattered helmet lay near the base of the wall, and dark smears showed where men had fought and fallen. The gates into the Holdfast proper were sealed, thick iron-bound doors that might not easily yield even to a battering ram. But any defenders perched above were eerily silent. Robb had expected another volley of arrows or at least a chorus of threats. The Great John exhaled a steaming breath in the cool interior air. "They're cornered," he muttered. "Rats in a trap." Robb circled around, seeking another entrance. A side door, smaller and less fortified, appeared to be flung ajar. Overturned crates and scattered straw suggested a hurried flight or desperate search for supplies. Motioning for the Great John to keep watch, Robb and Grey Wind stepped inside. The corridor was narrow, the walls closed, the flicker of a single torch dancing on damp stone. Each step echoed. Robb's senses prickled, expecting an ambush at any moment. A sharp laugh rang out from somewhere ahead, high and brittle. Robb froze, realizing whose voice it was. Joffrey Baratheon, that cruel, simpering boy who had ordered Ned Stark's death. Fury churned in Robb's gut, but he forced himself to move forward carefully. A second voice, softer but laced with venom, spoke next. Cersei Lannister, no doubt. Whatever argument they were having, it was heated. He crept closer, passing through an archway into a larger chamber. It was a guardroom of some sort, with weapon racks along the walls, mostly empty now. A single lantern cast shifting shadows across the stones. There they were, Joffrey and Cersei, along with a handful of Lannister guards, one of whom wore a Kingsguard cloak. They had backed themselves into a corner, near a door that presumably led deeper into Maegor's Holdfast. The look on their faces was grim, except for Joffrey, whose eyes darted wildly as though considering whether to throw himself at Robb or flee altogether. Cersei's fine gown was torn at the hem, and her hair looked disheveled. She held a small dagger in one hand, though she gripped it uncertainly. The Kingsguard knight, identifiable by his white cloak, Ser Meryn Trant, if Robb recalled correctly, stood with his sword raised, though the sweat on his brow betrayed his fear. There were perhaps 3 other guards, battered and weary, forming a shaky line around their king and queen. Joffrey's shrill voice sliced through the stale air. "You, traitor! You have no right to be here." He brandished a sword that looked too large for his slender arms. "I'm the king. I'll have your head, Stark." Robb was struck by the absurdity of it, remembering how Joffrey had crowed about Ned Stark's death on the steps of the Great September. To see him now, cornered and trembling with adolescent rage, was almost laughable, except that the memory of Ned's final moments burned too raw. Robb kept his composure, raising his sword. Grey Wind growled low, teeth bared in a silent promise of violence. "You are no king," Robb said evenly. "You're a butcher's boy clothed in stolen finery. Lower your weapons and why? Oh, you'll live long enough to face a proper trial." "Trial?" Cersei spat, stepping forward despite her dagger hand trembling. "We are the rightful rulers of the 7 kingdoms. My son sits the throne by all the laws of Westeros. You northern dogs, you'll pay for this treachery." Yet her eyes flicked about, searching for any avenue of escape. She must have realized that the city had fallen, that no help was coming. Still, she clung to the last shreds of her pride. One of the guards, an older man with a scar down his cheek, looked ready to drop his sword. Robb sensed the flicker of uncertainty among the Lannister men. The Great John stepped in behind Robb, broad shoulders filling the archway. "Lay down your steel," he growled, "and maybe you'll keep your heads." Joffrey's face twisted with fury. "Fight! Damn you all! I'm your king!" He lurched toward the older guard as though to strike him from behind with his sword, infuriated by the man's hesitation. But before he could land the blow, Grey Wind leapt. The direwolf's jaws closed on the blade itself, wrenching it from Joffrey's hand and sending the boy stumbling into Ser Meryn's side. A chorus of gasps erupted. The Lannister guards took a collective step backward. In that heartbeat of confusion, Robb pressed the advantage. He lunged, sword angled for Ser Meryn's chest. The Kingsguard managed to parry, but the strength of the blow jarred him, and he staggered. The Great John bore down on another guard, who tried to swing a halberd in a desperate arc. Steel rang on steel, echoing in the cramped space. For a moment, it seemed like the guards would attempt to stand, but the older scar-faced man threw down his weapon, raising both hands in surrender. The others hesitated. Ser Meryn's gaze flicked to Joffrey, then to Cersei, as if pleading for direction. But the boy king cowered behind his mother now, unarmed and pale as a sheet. Cersei made a last, wild attempt, lunging at Robb with her dagger. He caught her wrist with his offhand, twisting it just enough to force her to drop the blade. She hissed in pain and stumbled. Robb shoved her aside with measured force, careful not to kill her in his rage. Cersei tumbled to the floor, cursing him with vitriolic fury, but powerless all the same. Ser Meryn, seeing all was lost, lowered his sword. One by one, the remaining guards did the same. Only Joffrey continued to thrash about with impotent threats. "You can't do this. I'll have you all executed. My mother will." He yelped as Grey Wind snarled too close, snapping his teeth with a menacing click. The boy's tirade died in his throat. Robb motioned for the Great John to disarm them. "Take their weapons. Bind their hands." His voice was quiet but unwavering. Joffrey glared, tears of rage in his eyes. Cersei pressed a trembling hand to her bruised wrist. She glowered at Robb, but the usual sly arrogance in her expression was gone, replaced by thinly veiled despair. "What will you do with us?" she asked, voice wavering between scorn and dread. Robb's answer was a cold echo of a vow. "You will face justice for what you've done. I won't see the realm suffer another day under your tyranny. This ends now." He turned away, forcing himself not to let emotion cloud his judgment. Ned Stark would have wanted a proper trial, not a summary execution born of rage. Robb intended to honor his father's ideals, no matter how satisfying it might have been to draw steel across Joffrey's throat. By the time they led the captives outside, more of Robb's men and Tyrell knights had arrived, drawn by the sound of conflict. Renley arrived as well, looking triumphant but weary, blood streaking his dented armor. When he glimpsed Joffrey bound and sniveling, he gave Robb a curt nod. They had done it. The Lannisters' hold on King's Landing was shattered. Word traveled fast. Within the hour, Lannister banners were ripped down from the Red Keep's ramparts, replaced with the dire Wolf of Stark and the Golden Rose of Tyrell, and even Renly's crown stag. Trumpets sounded in the city, but it was a new tune, an anthem of liberation as some of the citizens called it. The flames that licked certain districts were gradually brought under control, and the small folk emerged from hiding to witness the dawn of a new regime. Some cheered openly while others watched with cautious hope, uncertain whether their new rulers would be any kinder than the old. Amid the rubble in the throne room itself, the Iron Throne stood in all its jagged glory, forged of 1,000 swords. Robb approached it slowly, heart thudding in his chest. Once it had loomed as a symbol of everything that had taken his father away. Now it was a question, who would sit upon it, and at what cost? The hall was still strewn with debris, the echoes of battle lingering in the vaulted ceiling. Tyrell men guarded the doors, while Renly and Loras conferred quietly near the dais. Grey Wind padded beside Robb, his ears flicking at every echo. Catelyn arrived, leading Sansa, who looked wan and shaken but resolute. The moment Sansa saw Joffrey's crown lying discarded on the floor, knocked loose in the chaos, she shuddered. Her blue eyes, rimmed with red from crying, fixed on her brother. "It's really over," she breathed as if she couldn't quite believe it herself. "He can't hurt anyone else?" Robb took her trembling hands. "He won't. We have him under guard, and he'll face judgment for what he did to father." His voice carried more gentleness than he felt. Inside, he still warred with raw anger, but Sansa's fragile hope reminded him that vengeance had to be tempered with mercy, if only to avoid becoming a monster like Joffrey. She nodded, tears threatening to well in her eyes again. "I thank you, Robb." Then she added, voice trembling, "I only wish I knew where Arya is." He swallowed hard. The city was vast, and Arya had always been resourceful. He tried to hold onto the belief that she was alive and perhaps even beyond the city's walls by now. "We'll find her," he promised, glancing toward Catelyn, who looked on with mingled relief and grief. They had Sansa back, but their family was still fractured. Renly approached, clearing his throat. He glanced at the Iron Throne, then at Robb. "Well, King in the North," he said with a carefully measured smile, "we've accomplished what many said was impossible. King's Landing has fallen, and the Lannisters are vanquished, at least within these walls." His gaze flicked to the dais, where the towering seat of swords glimmered. "We should speak on what happens next." Robb squared his shoulders. "You intend to claim the throne." It was not a question. Renly had made his intentions clear from the start. The younger Baratheon brother believed he had the stronger claim, bolstered by popular support and the Tyrell alliance. Renly inclined his head, that practiced charm seeping back into his voice. "I do. But I also swore I would acknowledge the North's independence if that is your will. We've come too far and spilled too much blood to betray one another now." Catelyn stepped in, her voice measured and diplomatic. "We agreed that the North would not be bound by Southern rule. My son pledged to help you dethrone Joffrey in exchange for peace for our people." She paused, glancing at Robb. "Is that still your wish, Robb?" Robb felt all eyes on him. The great Jon, who stood behind them, grunted in approval as if to remind Robb of the North's centuries-old memory of independence. But Robb also felt the pressure of the realm's chaos. If he left the Iron Throne to Renly without ensuring stability, would his sisters and all Northerners truly be safe from future conflicts? Stannis Baratheon was still out there, stubborn and righteous, and the remnants of the Lannister forces would surely regroup if Tywin had anything to say about it. The realm teetered on the brink. He turned to Renly. "I mean to keep my word, but the realm is far from settled. If Stannis lays siege to Storm's End or sails upon these shores, if Tywin Lannister rallies in the west, we may be facing another war before the year is out. The North cannot bleed anymore. We must have real guarantees of peace." Renly nodded, clasping his hands behind his back. Marjorie Tyrell joined him, silent and composed. I understand. The Tyrells and I plan to consolidate our hold here, restore order, and see that those who supported Joffrey face justice. But if you want the North to remain free, we must craft a formal treaty, one that lords and small folk alike will recognize. I have no desire to force my rule on men who've chosen their own king. And you will release my sisters, Robb said. Sansa is already free, but Arya, we must search for her. We need the full cooperation of the city's watch, every resource to find her, if she's still within these walls. He paused, a flicker of pain crossing his face. Or if she's fled, we must track her steps. Renly tilted his head in sympathy. You have my word. Any resources you require, you shall have. Just then, a small ruckus near the main doors drew their attention. A handful of soldiers entered, leading a ragged old man wearing the gold and crimson tabard of House Lannister. He was clearly no lord, perhaps just a minor retainer, but the fear in his eyes was evident. One of the Tyrell knights nudged him forward. He claims to have news from the outside. From Tywin's host. Renly's brow furrowed. Speak then. What is Lord Tywin's condition? The man swallowed nervously. My lord. Your grace. Lord Tywin is still at Harrenhal, but word reached us that the castle was attacked by smaller forces loyal to the Starks and Tullis. They've seized parts of the supply lines. Lord Tywin he's short on food and coin, and many of his men are deserting. He paused, glancing at Robb with thinly concealed terror. Some say he might try to retreat west or make a desperate march on King's Landing. A hush fell. Robb exchanged a look with Catelyn. This news confirmed that Edmure Tully's efforts were indeed paying off. The Lannisters were in disarray. If Tywin tried to march on King's Landing now, he would find it under new rule. But Tywin was cunning. Perhaps he still had enough men to stage one last grand assault or slip away to Casterly Rock and rebuild there. Renly spoke first. If Tywin attempts to flee west, the roads to the Westerlands might be open for him. We could send riders to intercept, but that risks another bloody conflict. Perhaps we should demand his surrender instead. The Greyjohn rumbled a half-laugh. Tywin Lannister surrender? That old lion will sooner die with a sword in his hand. But we can let him starve at Harrenhal or force him to run. Either way, we hold the advantage. Robb considered the old man's words carefully. Tywin isn't the sort to yield easily, but if he's as desperate as we hear, he may not have the strength to break through the Riverlands. We can coordinate with Edmure. If Tywin tries to push south, we meet him. If he flees west, we can reinforce the Golden Tooth. He may yet sue for terms if the alternative is total annihilation. Renly exhaled a thoughtful sigh. We'll have to handle this carefully. Another pitched battle could rip the realm apart all over again. We need to show the lords of Westeros that there is a better path, one of stability. As the conversation turned to strategic planning, Robb caught a glimpse of Sansa lingering near the dais, staring at the Iron Throne with haunted eyes. Catelyn moved to comfort her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Robb's heart clenched at the sight. Sansa had endured so much under Joffrey. The nightmares she carried might never fully vanish. He forced his attention back to Renly. We'll see to the city first, feed the hungry, restore order, and round up any remaining Lannister loyalists who might cause trouble. After that, we'll address Tywin. That is, if you're still in agreement, King Renly. Renly offered a tight smile. I am King Robb. We stand together. In the ensuing days, the task of restoring some semblance of normalcy to King's Landing proved monumental. The small council, what was left of it, was thrown into upheaval. Peter Baelish had vanished, reportedly fleeing the city once it became clear Joffrey was doomed. Varys, the master of whispers, emerged from the shadows, quietly offering to help bring the city back under control. Robb never fully trusted him, but he recognized Varys's utility in ferreting out hidden pockets of resistance. A city that large had 1,000 corners in which malcontents could hide. Renly, taking temporary residence in the royal apartments, summoned the nobles who had gone to ground during the chaos. Many arrived trembling, uncertain whether they would be executed on sight. Yet Renly, at Marjorie's urging, extended cautious clemency to those who had not committed atrocities in Joffrey's name. This move made some of the northern lords grumble that he was being too lenient, but Robb recognized it might help prevent further uprisings. A realm constantly thirsting for revenge would never know peace. Robb established his own seat in the Red Keep's eastern wing, refusing to set foot in the royal suite. He had no desire to drape himself in the trappings of a southern king. In the courtyard below his chambers, Tyrell soldiers and northern bannermen stood side by side, an uneasy but functional alliance. Their presence kept order in the streets. Grain stores were opened under guard to feed the hungry, and small folk lined up from dawn until dusk for rations. Disease threatened in some districts where corpses from the battle had not yet been cleared, so Robb ordered a concerted effort to gather and burn the dead. There were pyres on the outskirts of the city that seemed to burn day and night, a grim reminder of the cost of conquest. Sansa stayed close by Catelyn, both of them reluctant to wander far in a place that held such terrible memories. She did ask, timidly, if she could go to the gardens behind the Red Keep, where once she had strolled under the watchful eyes of chaperones. Robb arranged a small escort, but she returned after only a short time, pale and silent. Perhaps the ghosts of Joffrey's torment lingered too vividly in every rosebush and marble bench. She had dreamt of the southern courts once, enchanted by their finery. Now the illusions had been shattered. Edmure Tully arrived several days after the city fell, leading a modest force of Riverland knights. He rode beneath the Tully trout, his armor dusty from the road. The meeting with Robb and Renley took place in the Great Hall, still marred by signs of battle, where Edmure relayed news that Tywin Lannister remained at Harrenhal, battered and short on supplies. He sent a few scouts toward the Trident, Edmure explained, but we turned them back easily. So far, he's held his men to the castle walls. It's possible he's waiting for reinforcements that will never come. Renly nodded thoughtfully. If we intercept any forces from the Westerlands, Tywin will have no choice but to parley or starve. Perhaps we can force a surrender with minimal bloodshed. The Grey John, who had been at Robb's side, made a dismissive sound. The old lion would deserve to rot in that cursed ruin after all the grief he caused. But maybe it's best to have him kneel so the realm sees the last Lannister power undone without another slaughter. It might make for fewer grudges. Robb glanced at Edmure. You've done well, uncle. Your forces bought us the time we needed to take King's Landing. Edmure allowed himself a weary smile. It's the least we could do after all the Riverlands have suffered. Perhaps now we'll find some peace. But the lines of worry around his eyes didn't disappear. The shadow of war clung to them all. Cersei, Joffrey, and the few remaining Lannisters of note were confined to secure chambers under heavy guard. Cersei had fallen silent, though her eyes still smoldered with resentment whenever Robb or Renly visited to question her. Joffrey alternated between sulking and raging, hurling insults at anyone who approached his cell. Ser Marantrant and the other Kingsguard were stripped of their white cloaks and awaited trial. The only question that remained was how exactly these trials would proceed. Renly suggested a formal spectacle to demonstrate royal justice, while Robb argued for a swifter approach. In the end, they settled on a compromise, a public trial for Joffrey, while the lesser offenders would be handled quietly. When the day arrived, crowds gathered in the Red Keep's outer courtyard, curious and bloodthirsty. They wanted to see the Boy King brought low. Renly presided on a wooden dais newly erected over the flagstones. By his side stood Margaery, poised and regal, and a row of Tyrell and Baratheon knights. Robb remained standing among his northern bannermen. Though many shouted for immediate execution, Robb refused to let the trial degenerate into a lynching. That was not the way of the North or of Ned Stark. Joffrey was dragged forward in chains, face pale as milk. The hush that fell was eerie considering how large the crowd was. His eyes darted around in panic, settling briefly on Robb. In that moment, Robb remembered how Joffrey had sneered during Ned's final moments, delighting in his cruelty. Now, the roles were reversed entirely. Charges were read: murder, tyranny, the killing of Eddard Stark, the torment of the smallfolk. Witnesses stepped forward, including Sansa herself, though her statement was taken in private to spare her from the public clamor. Others told of Joffrey's sadistic amusements, how he laughed at the suffering of cats, how he humiliated lords, how he threatened his servants with death. At every turn, Joffrey interrupted, shouting denials, calling them liars. He glared at Renly. You're the usurper. My father was King Robert and I am the rightful heir. Robb tensed at that, thinking how little Joffrey resembled Robert Baratheon. Renly's jaw tightened. We know the truth of your parentage, Renly said coldly, and even if it were otherwise, your crimes would still condemn you. He signaled for Joffrey to be silent, and the Lannister guards forcibly muffled the boy's mouth. In the end, the verdict was never in doubt. The crowd roared for justice, some shouting for the headsman's axe, others demanding that Joffrey be thrown to the dire wolves. Yet Robb found no satisfaction in it. He recalled Sansa's tears, the terror she had endured. He recalled Ned Stark's unwavering sense of mercy. For a moment, he almost considered whether banishing Joffrey or sending him to the Night's Watch might be the more honorable path. But then he remembered the boy's cruelty, the many lives destroyed at his whim, and realized that Joffrey would never change, never cease to be a danger to others. Renly left the sentence to Robb. It was a political gesture acknowledging the weight of Ned's murder and the North's suffering. The entire courtyard fell silent, waiting. Robb stepped forward, meeting Joffrey's furious, tear-streaked eyes. For the death of Eddard Stark, he said, voice resounding in the hush, for the persecution of innocents, and for crimes too numerous to name, I sentence you to die. May the gods have mercy on whatever soul lies within you. Joffrey tried to scream around his gag. The guard yanked him to his knees. Some in the crowd jeered, others watched with morbid fascination. Robb took no pleasure in it, but he would see the sentence carried out himself. He drew ice, the ancestral Valyrian steel sword of House Stark. As the hush deepened, he remembered how his father had taught him that the one who passes the sentence must swing the sword. The old way, Ned used to say. Our way. In a single, swift motion, Robb brought tea. He blade down. Joffrey's life ended on those blood-stained stones. In the city he had terrorized. For an instant, all Robb could hear was the rush of his own heartbeat. Then an uproar broke among the onlookers. Some cheered, some stood in stunned silence. The deed was done. Joffrey Baratheon, false king, was no more. In the days that followed, news of Joffrey's death spread across the 7 kingdoms like wildfire. Some lords welcomed it, relieved that a tyrant was gone. Others braced themselves, uncertain whether Stannis Baratheon would now rise to contest Renly's claim or if Tywin Lannister would attempt a final stand. Through it all, Robb focused on stabilizing the city and ensuring Sansa was safe. Cersei remained confined, awaiting her own trial. She had not spoken a word since the execution, as though shock had robbed her voice. For many in King's Landing, life improved rapidly. The new administration, half Baratheon, half Tyrell, with strong northern influence, distributed food fairly, ceased arbitrary punishments, and began repairing the damage from the siege. Houses Tarly and Rowan sent supplies from the Reach to help feed the capital. The squalor remained, but the hunger riots subsided. The small folk held out hope that this new rule might be kinder than what they had known. Yet Robb felt no sense of triumph. He met with lords and ladies, hammered out the details of a treaty granting the North its independence. Officially, the realm would be divided. Renly Baratheon as king on the Iron Throne, Robb Stark as king in the North, allied in mutual defense but separate in governance. Some southern lords grumbled, feeling that the North was getting special treatment. But Renly insisted that without Robb's support, King's Landing would have remained in Lannister hands. Over time, perhaps the division would become accepted custom, or perhaps future generations would test its boundaries again. Amid these negotiations, a twist of fate occurred. A group of black-cloaked men arrived at the city gates, bearing the sigil of the Night's Watch. They brought dire news of wildling incursions and reports of unsettling omens beyond the wall. Though many Southron lords dismissed these warnings as distant concerns, Robb did not. He remembered what his father had always taught him. The North faces dangers few in the South can fathom. An unspoken dread gnawed at him. Winter was coming, and with it, who knew what terrors might cross the wall. He resolved to return home soon. The North needed its king, not simply to hold a seat of power but to defend its people from threats old and new. He met privately with Renly and Marjorie. We are allies now, Robb told them, and will uphold that alliance. But the Night's Watch sends word of trouble beyond the wall. My people come first, and I must see to Winterfell's safety. Renly nodded. I understand. We'll remain here, consolidating the South and finishing any business with Tywin Lannister. If he surrenders, so much the better. If not, we'll crush him. He paused, eyes flicking to Marjorie. But should the North ever need aid, we'll send it. I promise you that, and I mean to keep this realm from falling back into chaos. Marjorie added. I've spoken with Lord Tarly about sending additional provisions north if the winter proves harsh. The Tyrell lands are fertile. We can spare some stores if the snows choke off trade routes to Winterfell. Robb inclined his head in gratitude. Thank you. Keep watch for any sign of Stannis. He may not yield quietly. Though rumors placed Stannis at Storm's End under siege by a motley force loyal to Renley, nothing was certain in these times. Nevertheless, Robb felt an urgency tugging him home. The city stank of politics and constant intrigue, and he yearned for the crisp air of the north, the open sky above Winterfell's battlements. He wanted to check on Bran and Rickon, to assure himself that his young brothers were safe, and that all the burdens he had carried had not been for naught. Saying farewell to Sansa proved difficult. She was free to travel north if she wished, yet she hesitated, unsettled by the notion of returning to Winterfell after living in King's Landing for so long. Part of her clung to the illusions of courtly life she had once cherished. But the city also held painful memories. In the end, Robb gently persuaded her to come home. "Our mother will be returning as well," he told her. "We'll rebuild what was lost. You'll see. The north may be cold, but it's home." She finally agreed, tears slipping down her cheeks as she recalled childhood joys. The snowdrifts in the Godswood, old Nan's stories by the fire, the crisp winter air that would sting her cheeks pink. Anything was better than the nightmares in these walls. By the time Robb prepared to depart, King's Landing had begun to settle into a new rhythm under Renly's rule. Executions of notorious war criminals were carried out, while lesser men were pardoned to labor in the city's reconstruction. Marjorie took a personal interest in the plight of the small folk, organizing a rudimentary soup kitchen near Flea Bottom, which won her the admiration of the poor. Some whispered that she was forging a legacy as a good queen, a stark contrast to the cruelty of Joffrey and the aloofness of Cersei. Cersei herself awaited trial for her complicity in Ned Stark's death and the abuses that followed. Robb did not stay to see its outcome. He suspected she would face either exile or a silent execution once Renly had no further use for her. He felt no pity for the woman who had orchestrated so much pain. Nor did he stay for the matter of Tywin, though he left behind instructions for Edmure and the Tully forces to coordinate with Renly if the Lannister patriarch made a last stand. With the capital firmly in Baratheon Tyrell hands, Robb saw no reason to linger. The day the northern host departed dawned clear, with only a thin pall of smoke drifting over the city from the final funeral pyres. A long column of horses and wagons wound out of the gates, carrying spoils of war and essential supplies for the trek home. Sansa rode near the front, close to Catelyn, who looked relieved to be leaving the Red Keep's shadow. Grey Wind bounded ahead, tail swishing as if he too sensed the change in direction. Homeward at last. Renly and Marjorie stood on the ramparts to watch them go. Renly raised a hand in a respectful salute. Robb returned the gesture, acknowledging that, for all their differences, they had accomplished something extraordinary together. They had toppled a tyrant and changed the shape of the Seven Kingdoms. As the Northmen rode, the crownlands spread before them in a patchwork of fields recovering from war. Robb glanced back only once at the walls of King's Landing receding into the distance. His father had died there, but the North's vengeance had shaken the realm. Whether that would usher in lasting peace or only breed new conflicts, he could not say. Still, he had kept his promises. Sansa was safe, the Lannisters broken, and justice done to Joffrey. The road ahead would not be simple. There would be negotiations, rebuilding, and the uncertain threat lurking beyond the wall. Yet Robb carried with him the memory of Ned Stark's quiet resolve, the sense of duty that had shaped his own sense of honor. He might have marched south as a prince of the North, thirsting for vengeance, but he returned as a king who had seen the worst of men and fought to remain steadfast. In the coming weeks, they passed through the Riverlands, reuniting briefly with Edmure Tully, who confirmed that Tywin Lannister's forces had split. Some scattered west, others surrendered outright. Harrenhal's haunted towers now bore the banners of Tully, a potent symbol that the old lion's dominion had collapsed. Word also spread that Stannis had indeed lost Storm's End, forced to fall back to Dragonstone. The realm's lines of power were redrawn, at least for the moment. Finally, as the air grew chill and the southern fields gave way to the rough terrain of the Neck, Robb felt an exhale of relief. He was back on northern soil, where the old gods held sway and the weirwoods whispered in ancient groves. When the high towers of Moat Cailin appeared on the horizon, battered yet still standing vigil over the north. A murmur passed through the ranks. They were almost home. Catelyn rode at Robb's side, a small smile curving her lips. "This is what your father wanted," she said softly. "A place where we can live in peace, free from the schemes of King's Landing." Robb nodded. "I only hope we can make it last." Thoughts of the Night's Watch warnings crept into his mind. Winter was on its way. He had seen a true winter only as a child. The older men spoke of how the land could turn unforgiving for years. And beyond the wall, wildlings gathered and darker tales circulated of undead wights. If half of that was true, the realm would soon face a threat greater than any mortal king. Yet he would do his duty and protect his people. That was what being king in the north meant. They continued north, across the swamps of the Neck, then through the winter-kissed forests that heralded the approach to Winterfell. The columns spread out somewhat, men eager to return to their own lands. Lords parted with loyal vows, heading to their keeps scattered across the north. The harvest would be crucial, preparing for the next snowfall, for whichever length of winter might be coming. When Winterfell's ancient walls finally appeared, Sansa let out a trembling breath. She had wept a little when they passed the spot where she used to dream of knights and princesses, but it was a gentler kind of tears, like remembering a childhood left behind. The gates of Winterfell swung open, and a party of guards welcomed them with cheers. Maester Luwin hurried forth, relief shining in his eyes. Beside him stood young Bran, perched on the shoulders of Hodder and little Rickon, who grinned at the sight of Robb and Sansa. Shaggy Dog, Rickon's black dire wolf, barked excitedly. The homecoming was bittersweet. They had won great victories and made the North free, but the cost had been Ned Stark's life and the scars all of them bore. Catelyn embraced Bran and Rickon, tears running down her cheeks. Sansa clung to them, promising never to leave them again. Even the great Jon, behind them, paused to wipe away something in his eye. Robb dismounted, placing a hand on Bran's arm. "I've missed you, little brother." He ruffled Rickon's hair, heart clenching as he realized how young they still were. The burdens of war should never have fallen on children, yet here they stood carrying the grief of a fractured family. That evening they gathered in Winterfell's great hall, a feast in honor of their return. The meal was hearty but modest, for the North seldom indulged in extravagant fare, especially with winter approaching. Roasted meats, turnips, thick bread, and dark ale flowed. The hall rang with lively chatter, though a thread of solemnity underscored each toast. They toasted to those who had fallen, to Ned Stark's memory, to the hope of peace in the North. Afterward, Robb walked alone to the godwood, feeling the soft crunch of fallen leaves underfoot. The heart tree stood silent, the face in its white bark seeming to regard him with timeless knowledge. Grey wind padded behind him, settling at the edge of the pool. Robb knelt, placing a hand on the cool moss at the foot of the weirwood. He shut his eyes, letting the hush of the ancient grove wash over him, remembering a time when his father would come here to pray. He could almost feel Ned's presence, as though the old gods had captured an echo of his spirit in the roots and boughs. "We did it, father," Robb whispered, voice cracking with emotion he had long held at bay. "The city is ours. Joffrey is dead. The realm, I've tried to bring it some measure of justice." A breeze stirred the leaves, carrying a faint rustle like a distant sigh. Robb took a shaky breath. "I'm king in the North now, but I swear I'll guide our people the way you would have wanted. With honor." He bowed his head. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind and his own heartbeat. Then Grey Wind rose and nudged his shoulder gently, as though urging him on. Robb stood, feeling an unexpected lightness in his chest. There was still so much work ahead, so many uncertainties. But here, at the heart tree, he felt a sense of calm purpose. An unbreakable bond to the North and the legacy of House Stark. The next day, he sat in council with Catelyn, Maester Luwin, and the principal northern lords who had returned. They discussed the distribution of men to guard key passages, the watchtowers that needed repairs, and the matter of provisioning the Night's Watch. Robb dispatched ravens to each major northern house, urging them to send supplies to Castle Black and keep an eye out for any wildling raids. All the while, he listened to the concerns of his people, who would serve as Justicar, who would handle trade negotiations with the Riverlands, how best to ensure the new lines of independence were respected without severing vital commerce. The tasks of governing were far more complex than leading armies to victory. Still, Robb tackled them with the same resolve that had led him to victory in the South. He had learned a harsh truth. Winning a throne, or in his case a crown, was easier than ruling wisely. Yet he embraced his responsibilities, determined to uphold the ideals that Ned Stark had lived by. If the old gods willed it, the North would stand strong against the coming winter and any other threat that might darken its gates. From time to time, news came down from the south. Renley Baratheon, now fully proclaimed king of the Seven Kingdoms, had installed a fresh small council. Tywin Lannister was reportedly surrounded in Harrenhal and might be near surrender. Cersei's trial dragged on, overshadowed by rumors of her incestuous affairs and manipulations. The realm might yet see more turbulence, but King's Landing was in no hurry to provoke the North again. Trade routes reopened, goods flowed once more along the King's Road, albeit under watchful eyes. Sansa began to find a measure of peace at Winterfell. She spent hours in the gardens, brushing her hands over the hardy northern blooms, or riding out with her siblings on mild days to reacquaint herself with the land she once called home. She still had nightmares about Joffrey's threats, but slowly, she reclaimed her sense of self in the quiet hush of Winterfell's walls. She would never be the same child who left for King's Landing full of pretty dreams, but neither would she remain the broken captive who had feared for her life every moment. One crisp morning, a patrol returned from beyond the last river with news of scattered wildling sightings. Nothing large, just a few raiding parties. Robb ordered additional patrols, reaffirming his vow to keep the North safe. He personally traveled to some of the nearer holdings, Deepwood Motte, the Rills, ensuring each had the men and resources to stand against stray raiders. At every stop, local lords and small folk greeted him with respect and gratitude, proud to call him king in the North. Yet Robb felt no arrogance in their praise, only a solemn awareness that their safety depended on his leadership. As months passed, winter's frosty breath crept closer. Snow dusted Winterfell's battlements, and the days grew short. Peace, however tenuous, held through the season. Ravens brought word that Tywin Lannister had indeed surrendered to Renly's terms, though some speculated the old lion was simply biding his time. Stannis remained in seclusion at Dragonstone, rumored to be brooding over mysterious omens in the flames. For the moment, the great Game of Thrones quieted, though few believed it was truly over. Robb spent many evenings in the Godswood, reflecting on the journey that had led him here. He recalled the moment at Riverrun when he decided to push south, forging alliances and outmaneuvering Tywin. He remembered how he had seized King's Landing and ended Joffrey's reign of terror. Now, his people looked to him to protect them from new dangers. He was proud, yes, but also sobered by the cost. Every time he passed Ned Stark's tomb in the crypts, he felt the weight of responsibility. Ned had not wanted a war, nor had he ever craved a throne. But fate had thrust that burden on his son, and Robb intended to bear it as honorably as he could. Late one night, when the sky was brilliant with stars and the courtyard was hushed by a fresh snowfall, Sansa and Bran found Robb by the courtyard hearth. He had been reading a missive from Renley about trading rights at White Harbor, but the weight of politics felt far away. The quiet hush of Winterfell lulled him into a rare moment of peace. Sansa sat beside him, gaze drifting toward the flames. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I remember all those stories I loved, about gallant knights and beautiful queens. I used to think King's Landing was like a song made real. But it wasn't, was it? It was dangerous. Ugly, even." Robb reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "The songs rarely tell the whole truth. There's beauty in the world, and there's horror. King's Landing has both. I think the North does too, but at least here we know ourselves better." She tilted her head, pondering his words. Then she offered a sad smile. "Thank you for bringing me home." Bran, perched next to them, shifted on the bench. Though his legs no longer worked as they once did, his spirit glowed with curiosity. "Will we ever go back?" he asked. "To King's Landing, I mean. If we're free, we don't have to, do we?" Robb looked at his younger brother, remembering how different life had been before the war. "We don't have to do anything, but we might choose to someday. Peace between the North and the South will require trust, and maybe even visits from time to time." He paused, ruffling Bran's hair. "But for now, we stay where we belong." A faint smile touched Bran's lips. Outside, The snowfall thickened, white flakes drifting down beneath torchlight. In the hush of that winter night, Robb felt a deep sense of kinship with the land and its people. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that ruling was not about the glory of conquest or the shimmer of crowns. It was about protection, stewardship, and sacrifice for those who looked to you with hope in their eyes. Far away, in the Red Keep's halls, others might still be plotting. Dorne might scheme in the shadows, Stannis might brood on the painted table at Dragonstone, and the Iron Islands might nurse their own ambitions. But for now, the North was at peace, and its king stood resolute, determined to guard it from any foe, be they Lannisters, Baratheons, or the nameless terrors rumored to stir in the far north. Whatever the future held, the North would remember. And so, in the quiet sanctity of Winterfell, with the snows drifting past the high walls and the hearth fires burning bright, Robb Stark, the young wolf, king in the north, found a semblance of solace. He did not sit upon the Iron Throne, but he did not need to. The seat he cherished was his father's seat at the head of the great table in Winterfell's hall, surrounded by those he loved, defending the land Ned Stark had taught him to treasure. The old gods bore silent witness to his vows, and as the hush of winter settled over the land, Robb Stark faced the future with steel in his hand, loyalty in his heart, and the unbreakable memory of honor guiding his every step. The days following Robb's return to Winterfell settled into a pattern at once reassuring and strange. He was home, yet he was no longer the same young man who had bid farewell to his brothers and sisters. In the courtyard so long ago, the men around him carried themselves differently, too, some with relief at being back on familiar ground, others with scars both visible and invisible from their time in the south. Even in victory, war left its indelible mark. Snow had begun to fall in earnest, dusting the ancient towers and outer walls. The courtyard lamps and braziers fought back the early dark. Some nights were pleasantly alive with conversation among the returned soldiers, glad to share stories around the hearth. Other nights, the wind howled through Winterfell's battlements, reminding everyone that the season ahead might prove harsh. Robb, robed in fur, took to walking the corridors at odd hours, checking on Sansa, peering into the library, or slipping into the Godswood to clear his mind of kingly burdens. He noticed changes in the keep itself, new timbers in the walls from the repairs after Theon Greyjoy's ill-fated attack months before, a slight shift in the temperature of the hot springs that warmed the floors. Small details, perhaps, but they underscored how time and events had pressed ever forward. He had begun receiving letters from various lords across the north. House Glover and House Mormont pledged their unwavering loyalty to the king in the north. House Bolton reported that their lands near the Dreadfort were secure. Each message reminded him of the delicate balance that now existed. The men followed him because he had delivered them from southern predation, but trust could fray if crises arose and were not handled swiftly. Winterfell itself was busier than Robb remembered. Some small folk, displaced by raids or uncertain harvests, had settled around the outer bailey. Seeking safety behind the Stark banner, they pitched tents or built modest huts, forming a makeshift village. Catelyn organized a system of food distribution, careful to ration supplies so that no one starved should the snows deepen. The older lords shook their heads, muttering that winter was no time to let so many gather. But Robb refused to send them away, not when they had nowhere else to go. He intended to honor his father's belief. When snows fall and the white winds blow, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. On a late afternoon when pale sunlight filtered through thinning clouds, a party of riders approached Winterfell. From the ramparts, the guards identified them as men wearing the triple spiral of House Reed. Robb descended to the courtyard to greet them, curious why the Crannogmen would venture this far north in winter's grip. When their leader, a lean fellow with a reed spear strapped across his back, dismounted, he bowed stiffly, as though unaccustomed to formal courtesies. He introduced himself as Kellen Reed, a cousin to Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch. "My lord, your grace, I should say," the man began, cheeks reddening in the cold. "Lord Howland sends you tidings from the Neck. Wildlings or some strange folk have been spotted skulking near the swamps. We seldom see them so far south. His voice was gravelly as if he'd swallowed peat moss. We drove off a small band. They wore hides and furs, spoke in a tongue none of us recognized. Not the free folk dialect we've heard from travelers. Robb felt a prickle of unease. The neck was well south of the wall. Wildlings occasionally ventured that far, but rarely in such numbers. And if these weren't the usual free folk, who were they? Thoughts flicked to the rumors from beyond the wall of scattered raiders fleeing the new leadership of Mance Rayder, or perhaps fleeing something else. Have they harmed anyone? He asked. Kellen shook his head. They seemed half-starved, more frightened than dangerous, but they attacked 2 of our watchmen unprovoked before fleeing. Lord Howland thinks more might come. He thought it best you be warned. Robb nodded, face grim. You did right to come. Stay here a night or 2. Rest your horses. Then carry my reply to Lord Howland. I will dispatch additional men to strengthen the next defenses and keep an eye on unusual movements. Kellen exhaled a plume of frosty breath. Aye, your grace. We'd be grateful. The swamp is our home, but we can't fight off an entire invasion if it comes to that. Robb clapped him on the shoulder and instructed the stable boys to tend to the riders' mounts. As the Crannogmen made their way to the great hall for warmth, Robb stood beneath the stark gray sky. The notion of wildlings or others sneaking down through the neck unsettled him. The dangers beyond the wall had always felt distant, but the Night's Watch had warned him that something was amiss up there, that more and more free folk were on the move. Perhaps the time had come to see for himself. If these were only rumors, fine, but if a true menace lurked, the North needed to prepare. That evening, as dusk settled into Winterfell, Robb convened a small council in the Solar. Only his most trusted advisors attended: Catelyn, Maester Lewin, the Great John, and a soft-spoken man named Hallis Hornwood, who had been helping Robb manage logistics. Sansa sat in a corner, quietly observing. She insisted she wanted to be more involved in such gatherings. Though she would never wield a sword on a battlefield, her experiences in King's Landing had given her an unexpected insight into courts and politics. Robb welcomed her presence, feeling her perspective might be valuable, especially when it came to how to handle potential alliances or negotiations. He told them about Kellen Reed's report. Faces turned serious as he described the strange group in the neck. The Great John snorted, crossing his thick arms. We'll chase off a few swamp-scuttling wildlings easy enough. Give me 50 men and I'll have them scurrying back to the wall or wherever they came from. Catelyn rested her hands on the table. But what if there are more? If the free folk are fleeing something worse, then we must find out. Hallis Hornwood nodded. My men have heard rumors too, free folk near the mountains on the western side, near the rills. Could be they're coming in from all directions. Robb leaned forward, hands curled on the tabletop. We can't dismiss this as mere rumor. The Night's Watch warned me they were stretched thin, that Mance Rayder was uniting the wildlings. If that's so, it might mean thousands could soon mass at the wall. Others might filter around, taking hidden paths through the swamps or the coasts. The last thing we need is chaos behind our lines. The Grayjon's bellowing laugh drew eyes. Well, I wouldn't mind a scrap if they think to raid our lands. But I understand the worry, your grace. We've only just finished one war, and most men are ready to put down their swords for the winter. Catelyn's gaze swept the room. If we wait until spring to act, it might be too late. We must see what truly stirs in the far north. Robb took a breath, recalling how, in old tales, the wall guarded against terrors beyond mortal comprehension. Ghost stories, most said. But the old gods, the White Walkers, the Long Night, these legends had shaped the North's identity. I should go to the wall, he said at last, letting the words settle. Speak to the Lord Commander, see the situation firsthand. If the threat is real, we'll mobilize. If not, we can assure our lords there's no need to fear. He saw Catelyn's concern flash in her eyes, but she did not contradict him. Instead, she reached for his hand. You've done so much traveling already, my son, she said softly. But if you believe you must, then we will support you. Just take enough men to keep you safe. The Great John smacked his fist against the table. I'll ride with you if you wish it, your grace. Robb nodded slowly. Yes, I'd have you with me. I'll take a solid corps of men, fewer than in the south, but enough to fend off trouble. Meanwhile, Mother, you'll remain here with Sansa and Bran. Keep the north running. Ensure supplies are ready if we must reinforce Castle Black. Send word to our bannermen that I'll soon have more news. A small hush settled as the plan took shape. Sansa spoke softly from her corner, voice steadier than Robb expected. Be careful, Robb. The things I've heard about beyond the wall, in King's Landing, they called them fairy tales, but I'm not sure I believe that anymore. Her words mirrored his own doubts. He offered a reassuring nod. I'll return soon, with truth one way or another. They spent the next few days gathering men for the journey. The Great John insisted on bringing at least 100 loyal fighters, mostly from the Umberlands, and a few Karstarks who had joined them on the march south. It would be a lean force compared to the thousands that had descended upon King's Landing, but they wanted speed and discretion. No sense dragging half the north with them for what might prove a fool's errand. Word spread that the king in the north was riding to the wall, and whispers of renewed tales about the others floated through the courtyard. Some scoffed at such nonsense. Others, older men and women who remembered grandparents' stories, exchanged worried looks. Robb sensed the tension, but at the same time saw curiosity among the younger soldiers who had never traveled so far north. It was a journey that felt steeped in the essence of old northern legend. On the morning they departed, the sky was a mottled gray and flurries danced in the cold wind. Robb stood at the gates with Catelyn, Sansa, and his brothers. Rickon clung to him for a moment, refusing to let go until Robb promised a swift return. Bran sat astride Hodder's broad shoulders, giving a solemn nod. Grey wind whined at Robb's side, eager for the road. Catelyn kissed her son's cheek, voice trembling. "The gods keep you safe." He smiled, though his chest felt tight. "Keep watch over Winterfell, mother." They set off north along the King's Road, which was frozen hard underfoot. Snowbanks piled in the ditches, and the sky threatened more before long. Robb rode at the head, with the Great John to his right. His direwolf padded along, often sprinting ahead to scout. The men behind them kept a brisk pace, not wanting to linger in the cold. Fires burned high each night as they established a tight camp ringed by sentries. They passed through small hamlets where folk peeked from shuttered windows or doors, calling out blessings or warnings. One old woman near a fork in the road insisted she'd seen strange lights at night, blue fires in the sky dancing above the treetops. Her granddaughter tugged her back inside, dismissing her words as the ramblings of age. Robb thanked them for any sightings and moved on, though the tale gnawed at him. A night later, the closer they drew to the wall, the more brutal the cold became. Frost rimed every beard and the horses snorted plumes of steam. Snow crunched under boots, deep enough in places to slow their march. Garrison towers loomed in the distance now, stark silhouettes against a white horizon. At last, they glimpsed it, a massive curtain of ice rising above the land, so vast it appeared like a frozen mountain range. Even those who had been there before paused in awe. The wall never ceased to inspire a mix of reverence and fear. Castle Black itself sprawled at the base of the wall, dark wooden structures against the pale glare of snow. Smoke trailed from chimneys and black banners rippled in the cutting wind. When Robb and his companions rode in, their arrival caused a stir among the black-cloaked brothers. Within moments, the courtyard was bustling with curious eyes. A horn sounded atop the ramparts, echoing across the ice fields. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch emerged to greet them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with hair streaked gray. He introduced himself as Jeor Mormont. Robb recognized the name, having met him once in Winterfell when he was only a child. Mormont's gruff warmth broke the tension. "Robb Stark, I heard you were a king now. You look the same to me, just older and more tired." Robb dismounted, clasping the older man's forearm. "We all are, Lord Commander. War ages us." He glanced around at the assembled watchmen, grimy, lean men with wary eyes. Some were ex-soldiers, others ex-convicts. Few looked well-fed, but all carried themselves with a somber discipline. "I've come to learn what's been happening beyond the wall. We've heard rumors of wildlings and more unusual talk." Mormont nodded, leading Robb and his retinue into the relative warmth of the common hall. "You'll hear the truth from me, but I warn you it'll sound like madness." Robb and the Great John shed their outer cloaks, letting the heat from a roaring fireplace seep into cold, stiffened limbs. Mormont gestured them toward a long table. Bowls of stew were produced, thin but hot. As they ate, the old bear spoke plainly. "Mance Rayder gathers the free folk, all of them, from every corner of the haunted forest and beyond. Some say giants march with him, that entire clans of raiders are uniting for the first time in generations. They're fleeing something, or so they claim. They speak of White Walkers, the others. Our rangers have found bodies. Strange killings. There's no denying it." Robb felt a chill deeper than any winter cold coil in his stomach. "White Walkers," he murmured, recalling old tales of ice whites and the long night. "You believe it?" Mormont exhaled heavily. "I believe something unnatural is out there. I've lost too many men. The signs all point to a darkness rising. Mance says he's leading his people south because he won't let them be slaughtered by whatever is stirring in the frost. If we do nothing, we'll face thousands of wildlings climbing the wall or trying to break through the gates. And if these tales of White Walkers are true, it's even worse than that." Silence fell over the table. The Great John, usually so full of boisterous talk, stared into his stew as though it might hold answers. Robb gripped the pewter cup in front of him. My father always said we must heed the Night's Watch. If there's a threat beyond the wall, the North can't ignore it. But how do we fight something out of legend? Mormont's expression was grim. Dragonglass, obsidian has some power over them if the old stories hold. Fire, too. But we need men more than anything. The Night's Watch is a shadow of what it once was. 300 or so left. Hardly enough to guard all our castles, let alone range beyond the wall. Robb's mind churned. He had won a throne in the south only to leave it to Renley. He had returned to the north believing the worst battles behind him. Yet now he faced a danger that could dwarf any Lannister threat. If Mance is truly leading a massive horde, no handful of men can stop them, he said. Unless we treat with him. If they only want to flee the walkers, maybe there's a way to avoid slaughter. Mormont's eyebrows rose. You'd let them cross into the north? Robb spread his hands. If the alternative is a war at the wall while something worse stalks them, we may have to consider it. Better to have them as allies against a greater threat. He noted the uneasy glances from some of the Black brothers. The Night's Watch had spent centuries repelling wildlings, not befriending them. Yet times had changed. The Great John snorted. Making friends of wildlings, never thought I'd see the day. But if your father taught me anything, it's that the real enemy is the one who'll kill us all, not the one we can talk down. Mormont sighed. I don't relish the idea. Many in the Watch will balk. But I can't deny we lack the numbers to hold the entire wall if Mance decides to come at us. Perhaps you could meet with him, Your Grace, see if there's any reason in him. I'm too old, too set in my ways for such business. Robb nodded slowly. I'll do it. I'll ride out. If we can avoid fighting each other, we might have some hope against these others. Plans were laid. Mormont offered to send a small detachment of Black brothers, men who had scouted beyond the wall. They knew the terrain and the secret passes. Robb would take a handful of his own men, 2, including the Great John, along with enough supplies for a few weeks in the wilderness. They would go beyond the wall via the main gate, traveling carefully until they reached one of Mance Raider's camps. A risky mission, one that might end in bloodshed if the wildlings attacked first. But if it worked, they might prevent a far greater disaster. The next morning, they stood at the vast tunnel that ran beneath the wall, barred by massive iron gates. Sentries with black cloaks unlatched them. On the far side, the wind whipped across a barren expanse of snow and ice, dotted with stunted trees. Robb pulled the hood of his fur cloak tighter, scanning the desolate horizon. Gray wind whined, nose twitching at scents carried by the gale. The party set out, each man wrapped in furs, carrying rations of dried meats, hard bread, and casks of fresh water. Mormont's rangers led the way, though they admitted with a grim smile that the conditions changed daily. They aimed for a known wildling haunt, a series of hidden valleys where Mance's scouts roamed. If Mance wanted peace, he'd likely place watchers there, looking for any approach by the Watch. They traveled in single file, the crunch of hooves and boots muffled by fresh snow. Occasionally, the rangers signaled to veer around a frozen lake or avoid a known crevasse. Night came swiftly, forcing them to make camp in shallow hollows, bundling themselves against sub-zero temperatures. The northern men were hardy, but even they shivered at night, cursing the relentless cold. Gray wind patrolled the perimeter, returning with bits of frosted fur clinging to his muzzle. On the fourth day beyond the wall, they caught sight of a plume of distant smoke. The rangers whispered that it might be a wildling camp. Robb ordered a cautious advance. They pitched a small camp behind a ridge, leaving most of their men there, while Robb, the Great John, and a single ranger named Ed Talit Dolorous Ed, the other Black brothers called him, scouted ahead on foot. The snow came to their knees in places. Ice clung to beards and eyelashes, and the cold bit like knives against exposed skin. Peering over the ridge, Robb spotted a cluster of hide tents in a shallow valley. Several figures moved about, tall men in patched furs, women hauling water from a half-frozen creek, a scattering of children chasing each other amid the drifts. Smoke rose from a central fire pit. No obvious sentries ringed the camp, but Robb guessed they'd already been spotted. Wildlings knew their land. Sure enough, a shout went up from one of the tents. Robb saw men grab spears and axes, scanning the surrounding ridges. Ed Talit muttered, "Well, they'll be at our throats soon. We might as well go down there." Robb exchanged a look with the great John, who shrugged, fists clenching in his thick gloves. Better to meet them on our terms than wait for an ambush, eh? They stood and walked openly down the slope, arms at their sides, though they kept their weapons in easy reach. Grey Wind padded behind Robb, tail stiff, ears pricked. At the sight of the dire wolf, several wildlings shouted warnings and drew back, forming a half-circle. Robb counted maybe 20 men of fighting age, a handful of women as well. Their clothes were rough, stitched hides. Their faces looked hollowed by hunger, and they stared at Robb's cloak, clearly recognizing the Northern King's finery. One man, a grizzled fellow with a braided beard and a wolfskin cloak, stepped forward, brandishing a notched spear. "You're from the Watch?" he demanded, eyes narrowed. Ed Tollett shook his head. "I'm of the Watch, friend. But these two are Northmen. They come in peace to talk with Mance Rayder." A murmur rippled among the wildlings. A tall woman with a scar across her cheek spat, "We don't trust crow words. Get out or we'll send your heads back to that wall." Robb raised his voice, calm but firm. "We're not here to fight. We want to speak with Mance about the others, the White Walkers. We've heard you're fleeing them." The mention of White Walkers made some flinch. Others gritted their teeth. The man with the braided beard lowered his spear slightly. "Aye, we're fleeing. And we'll keep fleeing until we're safe south of the wall. If you think to stop us, you'll have a war on your hands." Robb stepped forward slowly, showing empty palms. Grey Wind bristled but did not lunge. "I'm Robb Stark, king in the north. I don't want war. If Mance is open to talking, I'll prove that we can avoid bloodshed." The man's eyes widened a fraction as if the title struck a chord. Behind him, the woman with the scar scoffed. "He's lying. Southerners always lie." But the braided beard wildling muttered, "Stark, we've heard that name. Some say your father was a good man." He exchanged glances with the others. Then, after a tense pause, he thrust the butt of his spear into the snow. "Fine. We'll take you to the king beyond the wall. But don't try any crow tricks. We'll kill you quick." That was all the invitation Robb needed. He nodded, signaling to Ed and the great John that they would proceed. The rest of his men remained out of sight behind the ridge, waiting for a sign. Carefully, they followed the wildlings into the camp. The children stared wide-eyed at Grey Wind while an old woman muttered something about dire spirits. The tension remained palpable, but no one attacked. They spent the night in the wildling camp, bedded down near a smoky fire while the cold wind rattled the hide tents. Some of the wildlings asked about the South, about the wars. Robb answered truthfully, explaining how he had broken the Lannisters' power in the capital and then ceded the Iron Throne to Renley. The news sparked surprise, for many wildlings had believed the kneelers in the Seven Kingdoms would never let go of their crown. The Great John tried to lighten the mood with hearty tales of the battles, but the wildlings mostly listened in stony silence. They seemed too weary to care about southern politics. Their focus was on survival. At dawn, they set off again, guided by the braided-beard man, he called himself Herrick, and a few of his kin. They trekked eastward through a series of frozen ravines. A biting wind scoured the cliffs and the paths were perilous, slick with ice. One misstep could mean a tumble into a chasm. At times, Robb spotted massive footprints pressed into the snow, giant tracks, by the look of them. The wildlings offered no comment, but their guarded expressions confirmed the presence of creatures larger than men among Mance's ranks. After 2 days of hard travel, they crested a ridge to see a sprawling encampment below, nestled in a sheltered valley. Hundreds of tents spread out along the frozen river's edge. Beyond them, a forest of skeletal trees loomed, branches coated in frost. Smoke rose from dozens of fires, painting the gray sky with wispy plumes. Robb's heart pounded at the sight. This was no small band of free folk, this was an army. At the entrance to the encampment stood an imposing figure wrapped in thick black furs. He wore no crown, but his bearing marked him as a leader. Thick hair, some flecked with gray, framed a weathered face. When Herrick approached with Robb, the man's dark eyes flicked over them both. Then he turned and waved for someone in a nearby tent. Another man emerged, leaner, with a brooding intensity. Herrick announced, "These men come from south of the wall. One calls himself Robb Stark, the king in the north. He says he wants to speak with Mance Rayder." The big man let out a low chuckle. "Well, I'm Tormund Giantsbane, for one, and this is Mance Rayder, for the other." He gestured to the lean man. "Mance, this here's the Wolf King." Mance's eyes narrowed in curiosity. "I'd heard a rumor the wolves of Winterfell had grown bold, but I never thought to meet their king beyond the wall. You must be desperate or mad." Robb dismounted, ignoring the cold that sliced through his cloak. Grey Wind bounded off his horse's flank, sniffing the air. Mance studied the dire wolf but did not flinch. "We're neither desperate nor mad," Robb said, voice steady. "We want to avoid a war if we can. The Night's Watch speaks of White Walkers. Your people flee them. Maybe we can find common cause. A faint smile tugged at Mance's lips. Common cause. That's a phrase we don't hear often from the Kneelers. He cast a glance at Tormund, who shrugged. But I'm listening. They walked into the camp, weaving between tents that smelled of smoke, wet fur, and cooking meat. Curious eyes followed, some hostile, some wary. Mance led them to a central fire ring where a ring of stones provided shelter from the wind. Tormund fetched steaming cups of some bitter tea that stung the throat but brought warmth back to numb fingers. Robb explained his position, how the North was now effectively independent from the rest of the Seven Kingdoms, how rumors of an otherworldly threat had reached him, how he would prefer peace with the free folk to pointless slaughter. The Great John stood by, arms folded, occasionally nodding in agreement. Mance listened in silence, only interjecting with occasional questions. What do you gain by letting my people cross your precious borders, or what would you have us do in return? Robb's answer was simple. Fight beside us if the White Walkers come. Or at least don't fight us while we face them. If we stand together, we have a chance. If we fight each other, we might all die. Tormund barked a laugh. You talk like a man who's seen these walkers. But you said you haven't. Robb met his gaze evenly. No, but too many stories point to something terrible. The Night's Watch believes it. Even you're risking everything to move south. That tells me all I need to know. Mance's expression turned grim. We've seen them, or at least the aftermath. Frozen corpses that rise in the night, eyes like ice. I won't let my people be slaughtered. We mean to find refuge somewhere south of the wall where the dead can't reach us so easily. Robb took in a slow breath. If you come in force without warning, the North will answer with steel. But if you let me arrange a safe passage, fewer will die on both sides. The lords of the North might not love it, but they'll listen to me. Better that than a savage war in the snow. Mance shared a look with Tormund. Around them, other wildlings paused to eavesdrop, drawn by the talk of crossing the wall without bloodshed. Finally, Mance ran a hand through his hair. You're offering a chance at peace. I don't trust Kneelers, but you're a Stark, and we've heard some Starks are more honorable than the rest. We'll see if that's true. Tormund nodded fiercely. I'd sooner break bread than break skulls if it spares my family. But we won't kneel, mind you. Robb shook his head. I won't ask you to kneel. Only to respect our lands as guests. And in return, we'll share what we can, so long as you don't pillage or harm our folk. It sounded so straightforward in the telling. Yet Robb felt the enormity of it pressing on him. Integrating thousands of free folk into the North was no small matter. But the alternative, thousands of wildlings scaling the wall or dying to unholy terrors, was worse. Mance gestured for a woman with braided hair to approach. She had sharp eyes and a quick step. Dalla, he said, you and I will discuss the details with King Stark here. Tormund, see that their men are fed and watered. We'll need a day or two to decide if we trust them enough to move. Over the next several hours, Robb and the Great John hashed out broad terms with Mance and Dalla. The free folk would gather their scattered bands, with Robb's group escorting them to Castle Black. From there, they would negotiate safe passage into the north, possibly dispersing them across less populated regions under Stark oversight. In exchange, the wildlings would swear not to raid or harm northern settlements and would lend their strength if the White Walkers truly advanced southward. It was an uneasy accord hammered out by people who had been enemies for centuries. Suspicion ran high on both sides. At any hint of betrayal, the fragile peace would collapse. But as the day wore on, both Robb and Mance seemed to reach a grudging respect for each other. When Tormund insisted on a round of rough moonshine to seal the deal, the Great John joined in enthusiastically, coughing and sputtering at the potent brew while wildlings laughed. A curious bond was forming in that icy valley, forged by mutual necessity. That night, Robb slept in a borrowed tent near Mance's own. Despite the uncertain tension, the camp was not without its lighter moments. Someone played a stringed instrument near a fire, children giggled as they chased one another, and Tormund's booming voice told outrageous tales that had even the Great John guffawing. Robb found it strangely comforting, as though war and politics could pause in the face of a more primal struggle to survive. Yet even in that moment of rare fellowship, a chill deeper than the cold stole over the camp. A hush drifted across the tents. Robb, half drowsing, jerked awake to the sound of distant howling. No, not wolves, something else. A keening that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. Gray wind leapt to his feet, ears flat, growling. Outside, men stirred, fear in their voices. Some murmured in the old tongue about the others. The wailing died as quickly as it began, leaving only the wind's moan. The wildlings seemed spooked, huddling close to their fires. Robb found Tormund and Mance near the main pit, grim-faced. "They're close," Tormund muttered, casting suspicious glances toward the black horizon. "Or else they want us to think they're close." Mance's hand clenched into a fist. "We can't wait here. We'll move at first light. We made our deal, Stark. Get us to that wall fast." Robb nodded, heart pounding. He had not seen the others, but in that moment, he felt their presence. Cold, relentless, and hungering for life. It lent an urgency to the alliance he had forged. Dawn could not come soon enough. They departed the valley the next day, a long caravan of free folk and a handful of black brothers, led by Robb's men. The numbers astounded him. Families with children, grim-faced warriors with battered weapons, giant kin loping on foot. He thought of how the northern lords would react when this ragged horde appeared at Castle Black, seeking entry. He steeled himself for the protests that would surely come. Better to face angry lords than an undead menace in their rear. Still, the scale of the logistical challenge frightened him. Their journey back to the wall proved tense but uneventful, the wildlings moving swiftly, as though driven by fear. No further eerie howls pierced the nights, but Robb noticed more than one sentinel scanning the horizon with haunted eyes. Occasionally, gray wind stiffened, sniffing the wind as if sensing an unseen presence. Yet nothing emerged to attack them, and they pushed on until the massive ice barrier loomed once more. Castle Black erupted into uproar the moment the watchmen on the ramparts saw thousands of wildlings approach. Horns sounded, and men rushed to man the defenses. Robb galloped ahead with the Great John and Mance, waving a white banner to signal truce. Even so, the crossbowmen above looked ready to loose bolts at the slightest provocation. Jeor Mormont strode out, roaring for calm as Tormund yelled back that they came in peace by the king in the North's invitation. Bit by bit, the shouting died down. The gates remained firmly shut, though, until Mormont could speak with Robb face to face. Chaos reigned for some time as watchmen argued that they could not possibly open the wall to wildlings. Mormont bellowed them into submission, reminding them that if Robb Stark had brokered a deal, the watch must at least listen. Meanwhile, the caravan behind them stretched across the tundra, children crying, men stamping their feet in the snow. Some brandished weapons, while others just huddled together. At length, the Lord Commander relented enough to open a portion of the massive tunnel, though armed guards flanked every step. Mance accompanied Robb inside. Tormund stayed outside with the bulk of the free folk, promising not to advance further without a signal. In the common hall, tension soared. Watch officers glowered at Mance, who stared back defiantly. Mormont's voice cut through the din. "If the king in the north vouches for a peace, we owe him a hearing." So Robb explained, just as he had to Mance. War between them served no one, not when the real threat loomed. If the wildlings came as refugees, not raiders, the north might find places to settle them. Mance added his own piece. If the watch refused, the free folk would find their way over or through the wall eventually. Better an orderly passage than a nightmarish bloodbath. A furious younger officer, a blond man named Alistair Thorne, protested. "This is madness. Wildlings have raided us for centuries. There can be no trust." Robb kept his temper in check. They've done so out of desperation or in pursuit of their freedom. Times have changed. If they're fleeing something worse, we can't pretend the wall will save us when it's an undead legion out there. The argument raged late into the night. Mormont asked pointed questions about how they would feed thousands of extra mouths, how they would ensure no one pillaged northern farmsteads. Robb promised to handle those concerns, to organize supply lines, to spread the free folk in small groups so as not to overwhelm any region. At last, exhaustion and the stark logic of survival wore down resistance. Mormont, though uneasy, agreed to let them pass. He insisted on a formal vow from Mance that his people would abide by the truce. To everyone's astonishment, Mance gave it, swearing on the old gods. Outside, the wildlings set up temporary camps around the base of the wall while large groups began filtering south through Castle Black's gate. The Black brothers watched warily, crossbows trained, but no violence erupted. Families trudged past with what meager possessions they owned. Children looked wide-eyed at the great ice tunnel while the men muttered about the unnatural cold. Robb guided them, ensuring each group was counted. He sent urgent ravens to Winterfell and every major northern seat, warning them to expect arrivals of free folk, cautioning that they came in peace. He knew some lords would be furious, but there was no turning back. The alternative was slaughter and chaos. In the days that followed, the first trickle of wildlings reached the Gift, the lands owned by the Watch south of the Wall. There they found farmland that had long lain fallow or lacked enough hands to till. Robb instructed certain watchers to direct them further south if needed. He would ride ahead to coordinate with local castellan lords. Meanwhile, Mance remained near Castle Black, sending word to other wildling bands still scattered. The Great John, despite his earlier misgivings, found himself surprisingly sympathetic. "They're ragged and hungry, he said as he oversaw a group crossing, but they're just folk wanting to live." Once the bulk of them had passed, Robb conferred with Mance one last time near the wall. "I'll travel south and prepare my lords," Robb said. "You keep the peace among your people. No raiding, no kidnapping. If there's trouble, I'll hold you responsible." Mance nodded gravely. "I understand. We're not fools. We've lost enough to the cold and the walkers. We won't throw this chance away." They clasped forearms, a gesture that still felt surreal. One man a king in the north, the other a king beyond the wall, forging a fragile alliance unheard of in living memory. Then Robb turned south, leading a small escort to spread the word across his lands. Grey Wind trotted at his side, tail lifting as they moved away from the monstrous wall. Snow still fell, yet Robb felt as though a new path had opened, one that might save thousands of lives. Their journey back was slow and fraught with questions. At small forts and villages, they found the Raven letters had arrived. Some local leaders raged about savage invaders. Others sighed in resignation, trusting House Stark to keep order. Robb gave what reassurances he could, reminding them that Ned Stark had always believed in fairness. If the free folk caused trouble, he would deal with it swiftly. But better to share northern land than face an army of the dead with enemies at their backs. When at last Winterfell's gates came into view once more, Robb felt a bone-deep weariness. The new crisis he'd inherited was more daunting than any southern war. Yet Catelyn's embrace in the courtyard and Sansa's relieved face buoyed him. He explained to them what he had done. Sansa stared in wonder. "You let them through the wall?" "All of them." Robb nodded. "Not all yet, but more will come. The alternative was a bloodbath or worse. We have a chance to unite against the true threat. Now we must prepare the north for new neighbors." Catelyn brushed snowflakes from her son's hair. "Ned would be proud you showed mercy. Let us hope your lords will see reason." Winterfell braced for the influx. Wagon loads of supplies were ordered from White Harbor while extra patrols fanned out to keep the peace. Soon, small groups of free folk appeared on the roads, families who had not seen farmland in their entire lives, marveling at old towers and inns. The culture clash was inevitable. Some free folk bickered with local peasants over thefts or rude gestures. But no large-scale violence erupted, thanks to a firm hand from Robb's men. As the deep of winter approached, Robb summoned a gathering of his principal bannermen to Winterfell, anticipating arguments. Lords Manderley, Glover, Serwyn, and others arrived, weary from travel. They filled the great hall with their retinues, stamping snow from cloaks and muttering about wildling hordes. When the council convened, the tension was palpable. Manderley, the large, ruddy-faced lord of White Harbor, spoke first. "Your Grace, I've fed your armies before, but feeding thousands of wildlings is a task I fear burdens my city beyond endurance." Robb listened, understanding the strain. "I'm not asking any single region to shoulder the entire load. We'll distribute them. Most will settle in the Gift or the lightly inhabited lands near the Old Mokalan. They can farm if we provide seed and tools." Lord Glover folded his arms. "And when they tire of farming, might they revert to raiding?" A murmur of agreement spread. Robb stood at the high seat, knuckles whitening on the carved wolf's head. "If they do, I will punish them. They know this. But so far, they've kept their word. We must not treat them like beasts unless we want them to act as such." Lady Mormont, Meage's sister Daisy, who had taken over certain duties on Bear Island, spoke up. "The Bear Island folk have lived under constant threat of raiders from the sea. If these free folk promise not to harm us, perhaps we can find common ground. Better that than having them at our throat while some undead terror creeps up behind us." That remark quieted some protests. The rumor of White Walkers left many skeptical, but none doubted that something dire had driven so many wildlings into risking Stark territory. The meeting wore on until compromise emerged. Each major house would allocate a portion of land for settlement. Our work detail with oversight from local castellans. The free folk would be subject to a separate but strict code of conduct. Any major infractions meant expulsion or worse. Robb hammered home that they were potential allies, not thralls, though they must respect the laws of the North. It was an uneasy resolution, but enough to stave off outright rebellion among the lords. In the following weeks, a trickle of wildlings arrived at each designated location, some under the watch of black brothers who had grown surprisingly sympathetic. Others roamed in small family groups guided by instructions pinned with the Stark seal. Not all was smooth as fights broke out. A handful of barns were burned under suspicious circumstances, but local sheriffs enforced Robb's edicts firmly and the trouble remained contained. In some places, wildlings even traded furs or joined hunting parties with Northmen, forging bonds in the hush of the winter woods. As the season deepened, an unexpected calm settled over the north. The devastation of war against the Lannisters felt distant, overshadowed by the careful forging of a new society. Sansa found her days occupied with helping Maester Luwin track supplies and hearing complaints from both old and new subjects. She showed a knack for diplomacy, smoothing tensions between a local farmer and a wildling mother who had let her children chase the farmer's chickens. Robb, noticing her deftness, began assigning her more tasks, and she rose to the challenge with a quiet determination. She could not wield a sword, but she could wield courtesy and empathy. Catelyn wrote letters to Riverrun explaining the changes. Edmure Tully, baffled, replied that he hardly knew the region Robb described anymore, a place where wildlings roamed openly. Yet he trusted his nephew's judgment. News from the rest of the realm was sparse. Renley remained on the Iron Throne, apparently consolidating power in the Crownlands. No fresh wars had erupted. Tywin Lannister was said to be an unwilling guest at Casterly Rock, diminished in authority. Stannis brooded on Dragonstone. For once, peace held. That still left the greatest threat unaccounted for. Each raven from Castle Black told of more scouts heading out beyond the wall, searching for signs of the others. Some found only empty wilderness and the bodies of animals half-frozen. Others reported glimpses of pale figures in the trees. No definitive answers, only a sense of mounting dread. One afternoon, as Robb strolled along Winterfell's walls, gray wind close by, he surveyed the comings and goings in the courtyard below. Wildling hunters delivering pelts, a cluster of northern farmers delivering grain. Some uneasy glances were exchanged, but no violence. The swirl of activity felt oddly hopeful. He thought of his father's dream of a united North, one that valued honor and community. Then a raven arrived from Castle Black, bearing Lord Commander Mormont's seal. Robb opened it under the gray sky, leaning against the stone battlements as a gust of cold wind ruffled his hair. The parchment read, "We have sightings of a white-eyed wight near the gorge. The rangers dispatched it with fire. Lost 2 men. The dead are restless, my lord. Prepare." The note chilled him. Glancing at gray wind, he felt his direwolf's tension. The real battle lay ahead. Everything they had done, overthrowing Joffrey, forging a treaty with the Free Folk, was but a prelude to the war that might come with the winter storms. Yet he took a slow breath and reminded himself that he was king in the north. He would face this threat as he had all others, with courage, resolve, and the memory of Ned Stark guiding him. Descending the steps, he passed between guards who saluted. Across the yard, Sansa was speaking with a woman wrapped in furs, apparently one of Mance's people. They smiled at each other, however tentatively, as they concluded their chat. Nearby, a pair of stable boys, one northern-born, one wildling, worked side by side, attempting to calm a skittish horse. In that modest yet remarkable moment, Robb saw the seeds of what could be a new era for the North, diverse, resilient, united by shared fate rather than blood. If they survived the White Walkers, they might emerge stronger than any kingdom in living memory. The threat of eternal winter loomed, but the North would face it together. The wolves of Winterfell, old and new, would stand as one pack against the cold. And so Robb Stark, who had marched south to avenge his father and claim a crown, now found himself forging alliances beyond the wall and shaping the future of the North in ways none of his ancestors had ever imagined. Perhaps the songs would tell of this era differently than the endless sagas of kings at war. Perhaps they would sing of a time when a Stark king dared to make peace with old enemies, confronting a terror older than the first men. Whether the bards chose to honor it or not, Robb knew what he must do. He would keep the North safe and stand against the gathering darkness until his last breath. For that was the duty he had inherited and the duty he embraced with the fierce resolve of a wolf guarding its own in the heart of winter.